The Honorable, the Speaker.
You have 12? Makes it 12? Member for Port of Spain, North St. Anne's West, you have 10 minutes and 54 seconds of extended time left.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, just before the break, I was respectfully trying to bring my contribution to a conclusion by just reminding the House what exactly it is, in my respectful opinion, this simple bill is meant to achieve, and the importance of what it sets out to do and what it is setting out to achieve. So, Madam Speaker, as I said, what it is small Trinidad and Tobago playing its part in fighting terrorism on a global front, and us playing our part in fulfilling our international FATF, CFATF, and other obligations to ensure that we're not de-risked and that we don't lose our correspondent banking. Madam Speaker, I am certain that the constituents of Port of Spain, North St. Anne's West would appreciate this, as there are many constituents there who have families away and have to engage in wire transferring, receiving wire transfers of money, sending money to and from abroad. And therefore, Madam Speaker, this is a very needed piece of legislation and plays a very important part and role in us keeping our correspondent banking and ensuring we're not de-risked. And having said that, Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the Attorney General, all of the technocrats in the Ministry of the Attorney General, the Ministry of Finance, who work very hard, and also at the Ministry of National Security in ensuring that we continue to meet our international obligations in this arena. And with those few words, Madam Speaker, I end my contribution.
Member for Point Fortem.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise for a very brief moment, really, to contribute to the debate this afternoon. And it really has to do with when I heard the contribution made by the member for Naparima, who spent a long time treating with international cooperation and how much was done under the then administration. I want to debunk that a bit, Madam Speaker. I want to debunk that a bit because it has to do with, he mentioned also respect to weapons of mass destruction, to the extent where he even tried to label the member for San Fernando West in the same context of weapons of mass destruction. Also want to debunk that too, Madam Speaker. He seemed to be going all over the place, quite frankly, and not really contributing towards the bill in any significant way. But when one looks at the bill itself, Madam Speaker, international cooperation was in fact, to a large extent, deteriorated significantly under the large administration. One can only recall when we came into office, the relationship between, from a regional level, the relationship between the wider CARICOM and Trinidad and Tobago had deteriorated significantly under the last administration. We heard remarks where the then Prime Minister had referred to Trinidad and Tobago in the context of an ATM machine. We saw the indifference between Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. We saw a strained relationship between Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica and some of the wider Caribbean countries. Even at the level of national security. Trinidad and Tobago, I recall, Madam Speaker, at the time when I was serving Chief of Defense Staff, I was in fact the first chairman of the Chief of Staffs of the Caribbean, together with my counterpart then, Commissioner of Police Trevor Paul, who was also the chairman of the CARICOM Police Association. And we shared that what we did, we built up a kind of camaraderie, we built up a kind of association that put Trinidad and Tobago in strong standing in the Caribbean community, Madam Speaker. We also had at the time, our Prime Minister was the lead, of course, Minister for Security within CARICOM. And the then Minister of National Security, Martin Joseph, God bless his soul, was also chairman of CONSTE, National Security and Law Enforcement Ministers. So in other words, Madam Speaker, we had the lead Prime Minister, we had the National Security Minister as chair of CONSTE, we had the Chief of Defense Staff as chairman of the military chiefs, and the Commissioner of Police. I say that to tell you that there was a strong understanding in terms of cooperation within CARICOM. And we saw that deterioration took place from the time the last administration came in from 2010 to 2015. So when the member for Naparima talk about international cooperation, let's start at the regional level. We went further, Madam Speaker, to look at our relationship with our international partners and international agencies. And I know that the member for Port of Spain, North, St. Anne's West mentioned our relationship then with international partners, the level of trust that they had. And that, Madam Speaker, was a fact. It was a fact in the sense that we saw a level of deterioration to international cooperation, even at that level. So when the member for Naparima talk about that administration built on international cooperation, as a matter of fact, Madam Speaker, it deteriorated considerably. He spoke about the weapons of mass destruction. I don't think he understands what weapons of mass destruction really is. He seemed to have been lost in his definition of weapons of mass destruction. And so he made an inkling or a connection between that and the member for San Fernando West, which again I felt was misguided. Madam Speaker, when we look at the bill itself, it suggests to us that this government is heading on the right track. We are no doubt, Madam Speaker, dealing with not just proliferation financing, which, as it says here in the Act, defined as providing funds or financial services which are used in whole or in part for the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, and their means of delivery and related materials, including both technologies and dual-use goods, for non-legitimate purposes in contravention of any written law or way applicable international obligations. Madam Speaker, that definition has some bearing on us here within the Caribbean. While we do not deal or handle nuclear and biological weapons and so on, we are in a geographic position that affects us in terms of the transshipment or movement of biological materials. Based on our geography, based on where we are in the line, what we call the line of sight, or the line of passage, for biological and nuclear weapons, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, there is a relationship between the bill and what we are trying to do. And the amendments, as mentioned by the AG, are very significant in positioning Trinidad and Tobago in an area where we play our part within the international system, within the international world system. So, Madam Speaker, I want to impress that we are well on our way to re-establishing Trinidad and Tobago as a place where we can make our name and make our presence felt, to build. And this is what we have been doing for the last couple of years, Madam Speaker. We have actually been building back our relationship, building back the name of Trinidad and Tobago, taking it back from where the last administration took us down into the depths, where we lost our respect, we lost to a large extent the name Trinidad and Tobago. Didn't mean much during the last 5 years between 2010 and 2015. So even while we are dealing with our vision and our future, we still have to continue rebuilding that foundation that we met. And one in which, Madam Speaker, mind you, we left it very much intact. In 2010, Madam Speaker, you recall that we were well about to secure our borders then. And I go back, I want to draw reference to that also. But when we talk about international security and regional security and so on, and the deterioration that took place, as mentioned by Naparima, you recall, Madam Speaker, that we lost, based on the decision that was made by the last administration, the offshore patrol vessels. And I know it's something that we've spoken about time and time again, but it's not something that we should forget. We ought not to forget that when we left office in 2010, we had a definite plan to secure this country. We had a plan to secure the borders of this country. The offshore patrol vessels was not just a vessel, they were not just ships. They were a platform, an operational platform that was designed to secure the borders of Trinidad and Tobago. And they give us, again, the long reach, Madam Speaker.
I've allowed you some latitude, but I think you should bring what you're saying into this bill now, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'm drawing reference to really and truly, because our borders have a lot to do in how we, in terms of participate or relate to the whole question of transshipment and so on, and Bill speaks to that in terms of transshipment and transport. If you look at the definition I mentioned a while ago, Madam Speaker, it speaks to the movement of goods and services. It talks about transshipment. That has to do with maritime. It has to do with the maritime domain, and therefore, the offshore patrol vessels that the last government failed to take, that's now pride and joy of the Brazilian Navy, called the Trinidad-class vessel. It is something that would allow us to execute and implement aspect of this very same bill we're talking about, Madam Speaker. So that's why I draw the reference of it, isn't it? That's why I draw a reference to the matter of the offshore patrol vessels, because it also secured our borders, which is why we're in a state that we're in right now, based on the decisions that they took. And so, Madam Speaker, there is a relationship between the bill and what we're dealing with, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, as I said, I certainly want to just get into this debate, really to debunk basically what the member for Naparima said. And so, with those few words, Madam Speaker, I think I've done justice, Madam Speaker. So, thank you very much.
Member for St. Joseph.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, there are a few points that haven't been made yet today, but just to recap what the public should know. And to hear the contribution from Naparima again is really an exercise in futility. Madam Speaker, what we are here to do today is a Miscellaneous Provisions, Financial Institutions, Securities and Insurance Bill 2019. All we are doing, and this is why I don't understand why the UNC likes to throw red herrings at the public. We are here to do simply the following: to insert a definition for financing of terrorism into three pieces of legislations. The Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act number 4 of 2018 to include references to anti-terrorism. That is all. Madam Speaker, what we are here about today has a direct responsibility and a direct link to our ability as a sovereign nation to do business with the rest of the world. Every time we come to this chamber to do work on CFATF or FATF, the UNC always says why we are coming with it like a thief in the night. May I remind the public, Madam Speaker, when I was a senator in the Red House, this goes back to 2010, in the Red House, I distinctly remember the UNC coming with a piece of legislation at the last minute because we were going to be blacklisted the following day. And I remember distinctly Senator Faris Al-Rawi calling the then leader of the opposition and asking, what should we do? And the leader of the opposition said, if it's in the interest of Trinidad and Tobago, vote for it. Vote for it. And we gave you the 3/5. We gave you the three-fifths. Madam Speaker, to say that this is 3 years in the making, in my humble view, is a gross oversimplification and misleads the population. Misleads the population. What we are doing here is a mop-up exercise, a part of a mop-up exercise, because it's a miscellaneous provisions bill, because of UNC slothfulness and UNC laziness. Because this should have been done even under your tenure. Madam Speaker, if we don't do this today, what is at risk for Trinidad and Tobago, talking about de-risking and international banking? What is at risk?
Because I indulge 51B, tedious repetition. The member for Port of Spain,
No, not
North
at all.
St. Anne's
You
West,
did not
went
say
through
that. Thank you. Madam Speaker, I am going on a totally different path to the path taken by Minister Young. If we do not pass this piece of legislation, Trinidad and Tobago being one of the leading financial centers in the Caribbean, if we are de-risked, if we cannot engage in international banking, do our friends opposite understand the potential for financial havoc throughout the Caribbean? Throughout the Caribbean, and that is why we...
Mr. Young went through that 55(1)B.
No, he didn't.
Please continue, Member for St. Joseph.
Thank you. Minister Young did not take the Caribbean perspective. It is not only the economy of Trinidad and Tobago that could be affected. It is not only the financial stability of Trinidad and Tobago that can be affected. It is the entire Caribbean, because we trade. We trade with Jamaica. We trade with Guyana. We trade with Barbados. We trade with the OECS countries. We trade with Belize. This is what is at stake. And Madam Speaker, terrorism financing, whilst, as the Attorney General said, this hasn't visited our shores in any big way, we have to take cognizance of what is happening globally, whether it's in the USA, attacks on US soil, France, the UK, and most recently New Zealand. These people are financed. These things don't happen in a vacuum. We don't want that takes place in New York, that takes place in Paris, London, New Zealand, to happen in Trinidad and Tobago. So it is absolutely crucial that we pass this piece of legislation here today. Because proliferation financing, where you provide funds or financial services to the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export.
Standing order 55(1)B.
Nobody said that.
Okay, thank you again, Naparima, for inviting me. I will determine when there's tedious repetition, but thank you for inviting me. Please continue, St. Joseph.
Madam Speaker, the Hansard will show that no one has mentioned this definition of financial financing as yet. Development, export, transshipment, brokering, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear weapons. What member said is that Trinidad and Tobago does not produce nuclear weapons. Right? So that is what we are here about today, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, what we also have to realize, as Trinidad and Tobago is part of a global village, there are other organizations in other countries that look at us. For example, the Asia Pacific Group on money laundering. We have to make sure our laws are stable, our laws are robust, so that we can be a meaningful part of the international community. Madam Speaker, I know our friends opposite don't want this debate to happen because they are more concerned with their Monday night forum. But we are here to do the people's work in the people's chamber on a Monday. That is what we are here for, to do the people's work in the people's chamber on a Monday. So, Madam Speaker, with those few words, I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I thank you very much.
Member for Moruga Tebanan.
Madam Speaker, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to make a very brief intervention in terms of bringing some real-world comments to this act. Madam Speaker, oftentimes, and I have said this before in this Parliament, when we debate what seems to be very arcane or very obscure sounding on the surface, laws and legal changes, we often lose sight of the real-world impact of either A, making the law, passing the bill to become an act, or B, failing to do so. Madam Speaker, this act deals in a very direct way with circumstances peculiar to us, but circumstances that are affecting the entire world. Madam Speaker, for centuries, banking has been a global industry. That's well understood by everyone. What we understand in a very abstract way, but we need to understand in a very real way, is that crime, criminality, and terrorism are also global industries. And it is concerning here, but concerning everywhere, that there is a pollination or a filtration of the two. The world has made a concerted effort over a number of years, decades, to deal with that circumstance. And whether or not we are a small island developing nation or a small economy, we are not exempt from the wide and global influence of crime, criminality, and the potential for terrorism, either homegrown or international. So, as an historian looking at this kind of legislation, a number of things come to mind. Sometimes it seems as though it is a whole old neo-colonial or colonial arrangement where certain things are being dictated to us from on high, and we are just forced to conform. But Madam Speaker,
48.1, the relevance of colonialism in this debate.
Overruled.
Madam Speaker, I will reserve comment on the member for Pointe-a-Pierre's lack of comprehension. But I will move on. I will move on.
48.4.
Withdraw.
Okay, so member from Mugar Table, and while I know it's banter, maybe we should try to avoid any sort of personal inflections. Okay? Member for Cover South, you know, we complain, the left hand complain with the right hand, but it's the same thing. Okay, so just withdraw and you continue. I had overruled the first point. Okay, so you withdraw that and continue.
Madam Speaker, I withdraw and I'll rephrase. Maybe he did not understand the direction I was going. So I will explain for his benefit. Madam Speaker, it is a very easy conclusion to draw that this is a very sort of colonial relationship where large and powerful nations and their large and powerful institutions seem to make all the rules. We have no say in the rules. And then they seem to dictate that we follow a very specific pathway and we have no say in that. So if you look on the surface, you might get that impression. But Madam Speaker, when you understand the dangers that are faced with an ever-expanding international criminal network and the dangers faced by the reach and power of terrorism, we understand that sometimes strict and stringent measures must be enforced in terms of complying with certain international norms and rules and values. Madam Speaker, on the converse side, if we do not take the time to ventilate and vet this bill and then pass this act, there are very real consequences for us. And it's not just very arcane talk about banking and wire transfers and all of that. Madam Speaker, there are very real world problems that we can face that will affect us in the very, very short and immediate term and can affect the long-term future of the country. Madam Speaker, if you look specifically at the education sector, at the tertiary sector, Madam Speaker, this nation is blessed to have a number of very bright, very talented young people, and we are very blessed to have an understanding as a nation that investing in their future works
Madam,
to all of our
48-1.
benefit.
Overruled. Please continue.
I'll avoid any comment, Madam Speaker. We have hundreds of scholars all over this world, Madam Speaker, and they are managed from the Ministry of Education. Many of them attend schools overseas. Many of them attend schools in
48-1,
Europe.
Madam Speaker.
Many of them attend schools.
Member for Muruga Tableland, I'll allow you an opportunity to tie it in.
Yes, Madam.
Member for Kamuta Mansinala, I have overruled. Please continue.
Madam Speaker, as I was saying, we have hundreds of scholars studying overseas. The UK, continental Europe, North America. The funding comes from the Ministry of Education. How are we supposed to pay their tuition if there is no corresponding banking? How are we to pay for them to stay wherever they're staying, on campus or off campus, to rent without being able to do wire transfers?
Tedious repetition. It was said, that point has been said throughout Port of Spain North and St. Joseph, Madam Speaker. Please.
Overruled.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm very sure I've been awake throughout the entire debate, and I heard no one talk about education, or for that matter, no one talk about the impact of this act not passing, this bill not being ratified, could have on our very bright and very progressive young people who are studying overseas. Madam Speaker, if we don't follow through these steps to ensure that our banking institutions locally stay within the parameters that are acceptable to the international community, into the international banking community, that directly jeopardizes the education of hundreds of young people, and that, in a very real sense, jeopardizes the future of this nation. So, Madam Speaker, it is very fine for us to come here and debate minutiae, talk about clauses, talk about the impact, tweak words, play with semantics. But, Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, our failure to do what needs to be done, and we have, to some extent, labored over something that we should have had the maturity as a parliament to understand really works for the benefit of the entire nation. We labored to pass FATCA. We labored to deal with Global Forum.
Madam Speaker, 55-1B, please. Again.
But did I hear say 55-1D?
B, Madam Speaker.
Please continue, member.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And whereas I would contend that we really ought to have the maturity to understand that some things transcend the cut and thrust of politics, Madam Speaker, without doubt, the consequences for our nation, in the broad sense, the consequence for our banking industry, in a narrower sense, the consequences for those young people who are so integral to our future development as a nation, rests on our responsibility, our ability, our willingness to do what is needful for all of us. Madam Speaker, it might sound obscure, it might sound arcane, but this kind of thing, this act, passing this act, and ensuring that we stay within step.
Overruled.
Ensuring that we stay within step, member for Couva North, in doing all that has to be done to ensure that our banking sector doesn't carry the burden of that kind of negative labeling that can be ascribed to it, is very important to all of us. And Madam Speaker, with those few words, I thank you.
Member for Dabidi O'Meara.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to contribute to a very important bill that really, a small amendment by the Attorney General as Trinidad and Tobago seeks to take its place within the national community and to live up to our international obligations. In terms of the Financial Act, in this modern day, those who seek to enter into our borders use all different types of means to get financing, as the case may be, to get into
Madam
our
Speaker,
borders.
48-1.
Please continue.
When the People's Partnership was in government, they took a step that made our borders porous. And those who are involved in illegal acts and who use different means internationally to finance their activities.
Madam Speaker, 55-1B.
Member for Kamuta Manzanilla, unless you have a crystal ball, the member hasn't said anything else for me to read. And don't stand up to answer me, it's not a conversation. He hasn't said anything yet for me to know it's tedious repetition. Please continue.
Yes, they use all different means to finance means of getting illicit drugs, arms, ammunition, as the case may be, into our borders. It is a known fact that in the Amazon River Valley, they build submarines to get their drugs out of South America into the Caribbean Sea. And that needs financing. That needs financing. Right? And this bill that has been amended would allow us, as the bill clearly states, to, in clause 2, to deal with proliferation financing. And it talks about, in whole or in part, the financing services in acquisition, possession, development.
Okay, so I've allowed you some leeway to make an introduction, okay? And therefore, I think at this stage, you can go into what your points are.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The proliferation financing is in all three aspects. In terms of the Financial Institution Act, the Securities Act, in terms of the Insurance Act. And it is a means by which the government, following its international obligations, will deal with the different methods that those who are interested in getting into Trinidad and Tobago illegally will try to become involved. Through all means. For instance, it is a known fact that drug dealers and them would buy aircraft, fly them to a country with drugs, and abandon it. They have the money in which to finance these methods. And every loophole that we can plug to stop this from happening to our country is a plus for us. And therefore, I commend the Attorney General at this point in time in seeking to plug all these gaps. As I said again, thanks to the activities of our previous government, our borders are now porous. And it takes a lot of work.
Madam Speaker, 55-1B. I think the member is being repetitious against his own self.
Well, member for Dabadi Umera, I will at this stage uphold the objection based on 51B and the porous borders. It was well developed. I think you said it already. So move on to your next point.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And this also involves in terms of adding to the clause after the Anti-Terrorism Act, different clauses that the Attorney General, no doubt, would have done a lot of serious work, him and his staff, in bringing this bill to Parliament. And I thank you for this short contribution that I'm allowed to make. Thank you very much.
Oh, member for St. Anne's East.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, for the opportunity to intervene and to make an intervention in this debate on behalf of the constituency of St. Anne's East. Madam Speaker, I will not be long. However, the constituents of St. Anne's East think it very important that I stand and register that they are in support of Trinidad and Tobago being current with their international obligations, especially with respect to the Financial Institutions Act, and to ensure that we are not in any way going to make our citizens disadvantaged by our lack of meeting these obligations. Madam Speaker, this deals with proliferation financing and the whole issue of terrorism. And I note that last Friday in Trinidad and Tobago in Port of Spain, there was an explosion, small explosion happening. And if you had looked on social media at the response of our citizens to this kind of what was termed or could have been terrorism, it would make it very clear that our world has reached a point where we are not supporting this kind of action, and any measures taken to cut off the financial support to terrorism really have to be supported. And so on that day, when I was not in the country, I was in Guyana at the time, and when the constituents started asking me questions because they wanted to know if I knew if this was actually terrorism meeting us here. And of course, we were all heartened by the response of the Minister of National Security, the quick response, and everyone was glad that it was not terrorism. But that brought to bear the importance of us conforming to whatever international regulations would assist our world, because we are part of the global environment, and would assist us to not be so afraid. And so, Madam Speaker, the constituents of St. Anne's East want to register that they are in support of these amendments insofar as it ensures that our country puts ourselves on a global scale as being opposed to any type of proliferation financing, to any sort of financing of terrorist activities, as we well know, as we harken back to those dustbin bombs that we had a few years ago. We well know that we do not want to be seen or even suspected of encouraging that kind of activity by taking ourselves off of the international register, showing that we are not in support of that. So, Madam Speaker, I do not want to be much longer and risk the ire of the opposition, but I thought it very important to note that this is an important piece this is an important amendment that we are making to ensure that we register our disapproval of terrorism. And I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that this amendment is well supported. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Diego Martin, North East.
Yes.
I think it's necessary for members opposite to understand the situation we have found ourselves in. Because of the failure of the former administration to do what they were supposed to do, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the problem that we face in Trinidad and Tobago today is not confined to the Financial Action Task Force. We are now subject to two other entities, namely the Council of Europe and the Global Forum, Madam Speaker. And what has happened to us in terms of these types of issues, the matter before the House, the need to amend several of our laws, namely the Financial Institutions Act, the Securities Act, the Insurance Act, which are all acts that the Minister of Finance has to administer, Madam Speaker. What has happened to us in terms of the need at this time, with respect to this piece of legislation, is that we find ourselves not only under the microscope as it relates to the Financial Action Task Force and the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, but also the Council of Europe and the Global Forum, Madam Speaker. And what we have found is that the other two institutions that I've just mentioned, the Council of Europe and the Global Forum, piggyback on the findings of the Financial Action Task Force. And in particular, the Council of Europe does not do the same level of due diligence, the same level of investigation, the same level of face-to-face communication and dialogue with countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, as does the Financial Action Task Force. And I can tell you, Madam Speaker, that over the last 3.5 years, the Attorney General has had to visit a number of countries and a number of jurisdictions, and to carry a large team with him, including persons from the Ministry of National Security, the Director of Public Prosecution's Office, the Financial Intelligence Unit of the Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank, the Securities Exchange Commission, and every 3 months or so, I don't know how many times the Attorney General has had to hop on a plane and travel to various capitals of the world, in Europe in particular, in North America, and go into face-to-face dialogue with all of these organizations in order to stave off the effects of what was done by the predecessor government in the 2010 to 2015 period. And I have here, Madam Speaker, a publication from the Committee of Experts on the evaluation of anti-money laundering measures and the financing of terrorism. And today, Madam Speaker, the proliferation financing that we are looking at is a form of financing of terrorism, because the definition in the bill before us, it's quite extensive. If you go to the Council of Experts definition, it's a much simpler definition, but it means the same thing. And the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are defined as the transfer and export of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons, their means of delivery, and related materials. And, Madam Speaker, in our bill before the House, we have defined proliferation financing as the act of providing funds or financial services which are used in whole or in part for the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, the same type of weapons that the Council of Europe has identified. Now, in this communique, Madam Speaker, from the Committee of Experts on Money Laundering and Financing of Terrorism, the Council of Europe told us that the issue of proliferation has received international attention for many years. A number of conventions provide for measures to detect and prohibit proliferation, especially with regard to nuclear materials, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. These treaties do not, however, consider the aspect of financing proliferation, which is what this is all about. And, Madam Speaker, in 2004, the UN Security Council issued Resolution 1540, requiring states to put in place a number of measures in order to prevent the proliferation of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Subsequently, in 2007, FATF started to consider the threats related to proliferation financing and its interconnection with terrorism and terrorism financing. The interconnection, Madam Speaker, is based on the fact that proliferation might be a means for supporting the undertaking of terrorist activities. Its disruption is therefore essential for the prevention of terrorist acts. And in addition, Madam Speaker, the undertaking of proliferation financing often uses the same channels as terrorist financing. So the measures that countries have to apply need to disrupt proliferation financing and need to be similar to the measures applied to counter terrorist financing. Now, Madam Speaker, This has been going on for a very long time. This bill that is before us is merely the culmination of a number of measures that have been in formation since 2008, Madam Speaker. And if I look at the FATF report in 2010, Madam Speaker, because my colleague, Port of Spain North, St. Anne's West, read out the current FATF document, which is a 2019 document. But since 2010, Madam Speaker, February 2010, I have in my possession a statement put out by FATF entitled Combating Proliferation Financing, and a status report on policy development and consultation, Madam Speaker. And in this document, Madam Speaker, at that time, this is 9 years ago, Madam Speaker, FATF was looking at the international response to proliferation financing, scope for financial measures to counter proliferation, definitions of proliferation financing, and one of them we see in the bill today. It has evolved a lot since the year 2010. Criminalization of proliferation financing, and this is what we seek to do here in the amendment to the financial, pardon? Oh, I'm sorry, I was just holding the piece of paper in my hand, Madam Speaker. This is what we seek to do here in the amendment to the Financial Institutions Act, the Securities Act, and the Insurance Act, Madam Speaker. And arising from this document in 2010, it flowed into concepts like asset forfeiture, and we've recently had quite a lot of debate in this place and in the other place with respect to asset forfeiture, Madam Speaker. And then you had the whole concepts of mutual legal assistance and extradition and so on. And then, Madam Speaker, there were targeted financial sanctions such as UNSCR 1540 and other targeted financial sanctions, Madam Speaker. So that in 2010, if I go now to targeted financial sanctions, for example, these can be a positive and effective measure in disrupting WND proliferation.
Madam Speaker, 4410.
4410. What's 4410?
Member, the objection is how much reliance you're making on your notes, but I realize you're referring to a particular document. But please be reminded, it is a debate.
Madam Speaker, I have a lot of notes here, you know. This is only the first one, you know. Oh, I intend to read all of them until I am, Madam Speaker, until you decide that I am in breach of the standing orders. It is my intention to refer copiously to my notes, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, this is a very, you see, members opposite may want to trivialize what is a very serious matter. Quite so. They may wish to trivialize it. But the whole point of explaining how this issue has evolved since 2008, Madam Speaker, as a member of the Manning administration during the period 2001 and 2010, I was witness to the initiation, the evolution, and the creation of the whole concept of the requirement for a financial intelligence unit in Trinidad and Tobago. And that was something that evolved in 2007, 2008. Yeah. And if you look at the timeline from these documents that I'm reading, they also start in the period 2007 and 2008. And you see, we as a country, we need to go back into the past to understand our future, Madam Speaker. So that I remember being part of a government and we had to decide how would we create a financial intelligence unit to make us compliant, because what this bill is all about, Madam Speaker, is achieving compliance with the requirements of these international bodies, the Global Forum, the Council of Europe, and the Financial Action Task Force, Madam Speaker. So I recall back in 2008, we had to decide what kind of financial intelligence unit we would want. Would we want a standalone entity? Would we want an entity that is autonomous and completely independent? Should it have prosecutorial powers? Should it be an administrative unit? Should it be a department of the Ministry of Finance, Madam Speaker? Because at that time, there were many models around the world. And remember, this entire this entire framework of countries of the world looking around the world, looking at things like anti-money laundering, terrorist financing, it was now evolving, Madam Speaker, and we eventually decided to go with a department of the Ministry of Finance, being our financial intelligence unit. We use that model. And if I digress, I remember the member for Siparia subsequently using power of veto, I believe. The power of veto to select the head of the FIU. And this is after we came out in 2010, Madam Speaker. But the whole point is that it's all started in 2008. This country was required to establish a financial intelligence unit. It started with that. And then we had to have financial rules. Right. So you will see the financial intelligence unit over time, over the last 8 years or so, 10 years, developing various rules for regulated businesses like real estate companies, car dealers, lawyers, and pawnbrokers, and so on. And then you have financial obligation regulations pervading its way into the banking system. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough. You see, the reason why we are here today, Madam Speaker, is this thing has a life of its own. So every 6 months, something new occurs. Right. And in fact, the Attorney General, you're going off to the United States in the very near future. And we just hosted the Financial Action Task Force, Caribbean Financial Action Task Force here in Trinidad and Tobago.
For all members, we're very familiar with the standing orders. Could everybody ensure that their phone is off? The member with the offended phone, if you can go off, take care of your phone and return when you're sure that your phone is on silent. Member for Diego Martin North East.
Yes, Madam Speaker. So as I said, to understand our future, we must understand our past. And whereas members opposite like to trivialize matters, perhaps they have somewhere to go. That's more important than here. We need as a country to understand what's going on. So that we were required to establish this unit, and then we were required to introduce regulation of financial institutions and other types of listed businesses and so on. But as I said, these things have a life of their own. So as the FATF evolved and became more powerful, and you came up now with the concept of a blacklist, Madam Speaker, and I distinctly recall, back in the tenure of the previous government, I think it was 2011 or 2012, Trinidad and Tobago was placed on a negative list, let's call it that. That's right. A negative list, because of corrective action not taken by the former administration. And as a result, Madam Speaker, a number of citizens were told to close their accounts in financial institutions in the United States, particularly persons who had online brokerage accounts. That's right. I saw a letter myself, and I came to this Parliament, Madam Speaker, and I raised a matter on the motion for the adjournment, and I read out correspondence from brokerage houses in the United States indicating, financial brokerage houses, indicating that Trinidad and Tobago, this is 2012, we're talking about some year like that, 2013, Trinidad and Tobago was now on a list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. Right. And I saw the letter telling a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, I'm sorry, we can no longer allow you to trade online on the United States Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange anymore. We're closing your account because Trinidad and Tobago is now on a list of uncooperative jurisdictions deemed to be a jurisdiction that did not have sufficient laws to deal with money laundering and dirty money, as it is called, Madam Speaker. So that was 5 years ago. And what has happened since then? FATF has continued, and that is under the previous administration. So really, I urge members opposite, do not trivialize these things. These things are very, very serious. So that in 2012, around the same time, the FATF issued another guideline, Madam Speaker, called Best Practices Paper 2, Recommendation 2, Information Sharing and Exchange related to the financing of proliferation among relevant authorities at the domestic level, Madam Speaker. And in this paper, FATF set out best practices for information sharing and exchange among relevant authorities relating to the financing of proliferation, giving guidance on facilitating implementation of Recommendation 2 and the sharing of information between or among anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing authorities and authorities responsible for combating weapons of mass destruction, which is where we are today, Madam Speaker. This is since 2012. Remember, they were in government. They were in government. And at that time, we were not part of the Global Forum, or we were just about being introduced to the Global Forum by the former administration. At that time, you didn't have the Council of Europe piggybacking on the work of the Financial Action Task Force. In fact, it only happened within the last couple of years, Madam Speaker. So that in 2012, you had the Financial Action Task Force issuing these guidelines with respect to framework for information sharing between relevant authorities, identifying the agencies which may or may not need information to combat the financing of proliferation, possible mechanisms by which relevant agencies cooperate and where appropriate may coordinate domestically to combat the financing of proliferation. So I'm introducing this information into the Parliament, Madam Speaker, because as I said, it is necessary for us to understand where we are and where we are going if we go back in time and understand where we have come from, Madam Speaker. So that was 2012. And then we come now to 2013, Madam Speaker, where in 2013, FATF again issued a communique in June 2013, Madam Speaker, entitled The Implementation of Financial Provisions of United Nations Security Council Resolutions to Counter the Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction. So I've spoken about 2008, 2010, 2012, and now we come to 2013, Madam Speaker. And in 2013, FATF went one step further and started to talk about financial sanctions. And that's what's important in all of this. We need to understand the implications of not passing this bill here today, Madam Speaker. What will happen to Trinidad and Tobago, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, companies operating or incorporated or registering in Trinidad and Tobago, Madam Speaker? What will happen to them if we as a parliament do not pass this legislation and deal with this issue of proliferation financing, which, as I told you, Madam Speaker, has been evolving since 2008 to 2010 to 2010, 12, 13. So we come now to 2013, Madam Speaker. And again, this guidance in 2013 was designed to consolidate and update the previous guidance papers issued by FATF, such as the implementation of financial provisions of the UN Security Council resolution. And we heard a lot about the UN Security Council today. We heard the member for Naparima saying that Trinidad and Tobago could never ascend to the heights that St. Vincent has ascended to by becoming a member of the Security Council. That was completely repudiated by the member for Port of Spain North, who pointed out that the first CARICOM nation that became a member of the Security Council was Trinidad and Tobago in 1985-86 under a PNM government, Madam Speaker. So in 2013, FATF issued this guidance to consolidate further previous documentation, including the implementation of financial provisions of the UN Security Council resolutions to counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, which is a June 2007 statement made by the United Nations Security Council, Madam Speaker, and also the implementation of activity-based financial prohibitions under UN Security Council Resolution 1737 of October 2007, and the implementation of financial provisions of UN Security Council Resolution 1803 of October 2008. So you see how the thing is evolving: 2007, 2008, 10, 12, 13. And FATF also issued this communique to assist countries in implementing targeted financial sanctions relating to the prevention of weapons of mass destruction proliferation. And I just spoke to one sanction that citizens of Trinidad and Tobago were subject to in 2012, Madam Speaker. But the previous government, what did they do? in all of this melee, where you have FATF constantly updating its guidelines and its information with respect to what will happen to countries if they don't comply, they don't become compliant with all of the requirements of all these international bodies. What did Trinidad and Tobago do? Trinidad and Tobago joined us up to the Global Forum. Mm-hmm. And having done that, then the previous administration did very little to comply. And I can say as Minister of Finance, when I came in, and this is not hearsay because this is something that directly affected me, one of the first things I had to do in September of 2015, Madam Speaker, was to write a letter, as the member for Port of Spain North has pointed out, to the Global Forum asking for time. Because the previous administration had agreed to a deadline of September 30th, 2015, for full compliance with Global Forum requirements, Madam Speaker. And of course, that's impossible. We won the election on September the 7th, and we were sworn in as a cabinet on September the 11th. So we had 20 days to comply with Global Forum. Absolutely impossible. The Parliament had not even been convened yet, Madam Speaker, and most of the compliance was legislative in nature. It had to go through both houses of Parliament. Regulations had to be drafted and implemented and enforced. Of course, that was absolutely impossible, Madam Speaker. So that we sought an extension of time, which we received. But since then, the goalposts keep moving, Madam Speaker. The goalposts keep moving. Every other day, there's some other issue that these large countries are forcing small countries to comply with, Madam Speaker. And there's very little we can do about it. We can quarrel about it, we can complain about it, we can make a set of noise and so on, and say that we are sovereign countries and we don't have to listen to these large countries. But then what happens, Madam Speaker? Trinidad and Tobago might be an island in a physical, geographic sense, but it is not an island in terms of its place in the world, in terms of being a part of a global financial structure. So if a bank in Trinidad and Tobago has to send money, a person in Trinidad and Tobago wants to send money through a Trinidad bank to purchase goods or services in a foreign country, they have to use something called a correspondent bank. And let's use FCB, for example. One of FCB's correspondence banks is Wells Fargo of New York. So if a person in Trinidad and Tobago wants to send funds to Kansas, say, to buy materials for a petrochemical plant in Trinidad and Tobago, or a factory making plastic bags, as simple as that, you have to go through a correspondent bank in this case, it would be Wells Fargo of New York. What has happened with all of these organizations, FATF, Global Forum, EU Council of Ministers, and so on, is that they have told countries that they must stop these correspondent banking relationships with other countries that are not compliant with Global Forum, FATF, and EU Council of Experts. So it's a sort of a creeping problem that's coming at you. So every couple months, there's a new issue you have to deal with. One of the things you have to deal with, not just this proliferation financing, but we also have the question of free zones in Trinidad and Tobago coming at us. And all of these entities have told us that we must either close down or severely restrict our free zones in Trinidad and Tobago, because in the free zone there's what they consider to be unequal tax treatment of players, so that persons in a free zone would have to pay less tax than someone outside of a free zone and so on. You know what's the hard part about all of this, Madam Speaker? One of the largest countries in the world with the largest free zones is China, for example. But they don't take on Global Forum on them because they're huge. They're huge. So a huge country like China could say they're not bothering with the Global Forum because they're too big, so that people have to trade with them. But a little country like Trinidad and Tobago, you can't say that, you know. You can't say, we will ignore Global Forum, we will not do what they have to say, we will ignore FATF, we're going to ignore EU Council of Ministers, because what will happen is that the banks in these countries will decide it's too cumbersome, it's too difficult It's too tedious and it's too expensive to do business with people in Trinidad and Tobago because of the number of conditions that you will have to fulfill in order to be compliant, Madam Speaker. So that we don't have the size and we don't have that sort of power in the world, that we are a huge economy, the second or third largest economy in the world, so that we can...
It's the second largest.
China is, yes, is the second largest, so that they can chart their own way, and countries have to do business with them. They have no choice. You have the United States, for example. Recently, you would have seen where the Council of Ministers, and I'm reading from a document here, which is the Council of Europe, which is piggybacking on FATF and demanding this amendment before us, Madam Speaker. You had a situation where the EU Council of Ministers decided to list a number of countries in the world which, as far as they were concerned, was not compliant with these Global Forum requirements.
What?
What?
What? Nobody speaks about Europe, boy.
What? Same? Madam Speaker, they wouldn't even know what the Council of Europe was if it hit them in the face. Sit down and be educated now. So, Madam Speaker, sorry.
Member for Diego Martin, Northeast. I know sometimes you really want to get your point over, but I think with all of that, we have to be parliamentarians and honorable. Okay, so please exercise a little tolerance.
Madam Speaker,
You may proceed.
thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Good. Yes.
You may proceed.
Thank you
Not
very
go
much,
back.
Madam Speaker. Thank you very much for your ruling that I am totally relevant and not repetitious. The whole point is, Madam Speaker, that just a little while ago, the Council of Ministers in Europe decided they will negative the United States of America. United States of America and Saudi Arabia. Yes. So you have to understand what we are dealing with here in Trinidad. You have this institution in Europe where almost by VAPs, they get up one day and just say, right, these countries of the world are not compliant and we are going to negative list them, grey list them, blacklist them, as the case may be, Madam Speaker. And that actually happened the other day where a number of U.S. territories, Puerto Rico was listed by the EU Council of Ministers as being non-compliant. And Madam Speaker, my equivalent in the United States, the head of the U.S. Treasury, came out immediately and completely repudiated the actions of the EU Council of Ministers and told banks in the United States to just ignore them. Now, the United States could do that.
They could do that. The president
China. Yes, and I'm being told by the Attorney General that the United States is president of FATF. But they came out and told their banks in their territories, just ignore these people in Europe. But we in Trinidad and Tobago, we can't do that, Madam Speaker. We can't do that. Because they, as far as they are concerned, we must comply. And by this legislation before us.
Member for Diego Martin Northeast, your original 30 minutes are now spent. You're entitled 15 more minutes to complete your presentation.
Preach.
Madam Speaker, I now come to the February 2018 FATF guidance on counter-proliferation financing. So we've gone 2007, 8, 10, 12, 13. We now go to the 2018, which is the most relevant aspect of all of this and why we have to do what we are doing today, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, in 2018, or February 2018, just about over a year ago, we are now, apart from targeted financial sanctions, remember I showed you how this thing evolved. First it started with a concept. Then they required us to establish a financial intelligence unit. Then they required us to publish financial obligation regulations. Then they required...
notice. I think those points were very well made in chronological order and well appreciated. Please continue.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. So we're now coming to 2018. And the point I was making, Madam Speaker, is they've now moved beyond financial sanctions, which is the point that was introduced in 2013. They started to introduce the concept of sanctions. They're now introducing a requirement for interagency cooperation and coordination among authorities, Madam Speaker. So, and also supervision and monitoring of compliance, Madam Speaker. So we come to the point now where it's moved from its embryonic stage into a situation now where not only must we comply, but we are now under supervision. We are now being monitored, Madam Speaker. And this thing, as I said, has a life of its own, Madam Speaker, where we are required every couple of months to go and defend ourselves. And as the Attorney General said, I think we were the first country in the world to be in the last stage of FATF compliance. Is that it? Again, all because of what the position we found ourselves in with the previous administration. Let me come back to the free zones now, Madam Speaker. We have free zones operating in this country since over 20 years now, 25 years. And if we have to do what we are required to do, we may have to close down these free zones. And this is a significant employer of people, a significant contributor to the economy, significant source of economic activity, Madam Speaker. So right now, one of the things we are doing, because even though we're small, even though as a country we're small, we don't have the might of the United States, we don't have the might of China, Madam Speaker, we don't have the ability to tell people, well, we're not taking this on and you can choose whether to trade with us or not. I mean, I don't think I can't imagine there's any country in the world that can make a decision to refuse or decide not to trade the United States or China for that matter, Madam Speaker. So we don't have that kind of clout to say, well, don't trade with us now. What we are doing is using our best efforts to lobby, to engage in dialogue, to engage in discussions, to try and get these institutions, the Council of Europe, the Financial Action Task Force, the Global Forum, to see things our way, to understand that Trinidad and Tobago should not be on these lists. I recall a very interesting conversation with the head of the Global Forum, or one of the directors of Global Forum back in 2015 and in 2016, when the Global Forum decided, look, Trinidad and Tobago is not compliant. They have not done what they're supposed to do. And unfortunately, we're going to have to put them on a list that indicates some sort of negative connotation in terms of being a tax haven. And in fact, the headline in the newspapers shortly thereafter is that Trinidad and Tobago had been listed as a tax haven. And I got a call from one of the key people in the Global Forum in France, I believe, and he called to apologize. And he says they're very well aware in the Global Forum that Trinidad and Tobago is a real country. Those are his words. We know that Trinidad and Tobago is a real country. You are not a tax haven. You are not harboring terrorists. You're not a center of money laundering. We know that. But unfortunately, we require certain legislative changes. And until and unless you complete these legislative changes, we're going to have to put you on this list that makes people who don't know where Trinidad and Tobago is and don't know what Trinidad and Tobago is and don't know that, we have a highly regulated financial sector may conclude that Trinidad and Tobago is like some of the other tax havens in the world. He apologized. And they, in fact, sent people from the Global Forum to speak to us and to tell us what we could do to correct the matter. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, the things that we need to do require a special majority. Unfortunately. And we have an opposition that has decided to drag every piece of legislation that requires a special majority through a joint select committee for 2 years, 3 years, sometimes 4 years. And sometimes it comes out with no result at all. And I go back to what the Attorney General said, that he was at a meeting and they were reading out things said by the opposition about Trinidad and Tobago and what they will do and what they will not do. And these people take very careful note of what is said in this country and in this parliament, Madam Speaker. And even when we pass this bill here today, Madam Speaker, it still doesn't complete the whole thing. It doesn't complete the whole thing. Because there are many things we have to do, Madam Speaker, in order to become compliant. But we are constantly working at it. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, went to Germany recently, just about 2 weeks ago, and took with him a senior public servant from the Ministry of Finance, the one that is assigned to dealing with global foreign matters, and someone from the Attorney General's office in face-to-face meetings with people from Europe who wished to have a greater contact and dialogue with countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, specifically to deal with matters of this nature. And we were able to make some inroads there with face-to-face meetings as a country. Our Minister of Foreign Affairs and our technocrats were able to make inroads and progress in terms of dialogue with these European countries in Germany, Madam Speaker. And this is what it takes. And regrettably, this is what it's going to take for the next several years. They're going to have many visits, many missions going to Europe. In some of the other countries in the Caribbean, the visits have been done at the level of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister of St. Lucia, for example, went off to Europe recently, Madam Speaker. So the point is, over the last 10 to 12 years, there's been a concerted effort in the world to deal with terrorism. And the fundamental principle that is being addressed in this bill is combating terrorism. That's what this bill is all about. If you strip away all of the fancy language, what you will find is that this bill is all about combating terrorism. And the world has really become united because of what has happened. I guess it was driven by what occurred in 9/11. I guess that is where this push in the world, I mean, there are other incidents in Bali and so on, incidents in France and so on, Madam Speaker. But the world is now quite united in combating terrorism. And they're trying to hit terrorism wherever they can. Because what the terrorists were doing, one of the things, in addition to this proliferation financing, one of the things the terrorists were doing to finance terrorism is they would send small sums of money by wire transfer. So whereas the requirement for reporting financial transactions that are done in the normal way is quite a significant sum, there's a limit for wire transfers of $1,000 US. So if you send a series of wire transfers of $1,000 US, you're going to attract the attention of the international authorities, and you're going to run afoul of various financial regulations. So what the world is doing, and why we in Trinidad have to do this, what is in this bill today, is that we all have to do our part to combat terrorism, Madam Speaker. And therefore, with those few words, I am pleased to contribute to this bill. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
For please.
Pandois, again, if you had spent time in the gym, you would have won again today. I'm so sorry again. Madam Speaker, just a few words. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for joining this debate. I want to indicate that we have listened to the member for San Fernando West. We have listened to the member for Naparima, who made a brilliant contribution here today. And I want to advise in my opening statement, Madam Speaker, in my introduction, I want to advise the Attorney General to take the opportunity to wind up this debate rather than filibustering and ensure that, and Madam Speaker, please, I want to tell the government they can run, but they cannot hide. You cannot bring freedom of information and pensions at 12 o'clock midnight tonight and seek to undermine our democracy in the night. So I call upon the Attorney General to end this farce and this sham now and wind up this debate. Madam Speaker, I thank you.
48-1.
Okay, so member for Oropuch East, you've got your opening. Let's hear you on this bill.
Madam Speaker, I thank you. This is a sham and this is a farce. Thank you.
Member for San Fernando East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank you for the opportunity, Madam Speaker, to contribute to this act to amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act, Number 4 of 2018. And Madam Speaker, let me say at the outset that the member for Oropouche East cannot deny a member of this House putting the views of his constituents on the record.
Right.
And Madam Speaker, I'm sorry he left, because the member for Oropouche East is a constituent of mine and I speak on his behalf.
You understand?
And Madam Speaker, I am very happy. I'm very happy for this short contribution, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker,
Protection.
thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
This barroom voice.
Madam Speaker, I am happy to join my colleagues in support of this bill on behalf of the people of San Fernando East. Madam Speaker, it is the view of the people of San Fernando East that the proliferation of the weapons of mass destruction should be condemned, and those who are involved in the financing of the weapons of mass destruction should be made pariahs
Madam
of this
Speaker,
country, Madam Speaker.
55(1)B.
You're going to get banished.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. But Madam Speaker, we are again here debating this bill in keeping with our global obligations. And when we speak about the Financial Action Task Force, we speak about anti-money laundering. The Honorable Attorney General would have brought certain measures to this Honorable House to deal with anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, as the Minister of Finance would have just spoken about, and proliferation financing. And Madam Speaker, just give me the opportunity to remind this House that money laundering occurs after the predicate crime where funds are to be introduced into the financial system. Madam Speaker, it is dirty funds that we attempt to put measures in place to prevent the dirty money from getting into the financial system. But Madam Speaker, with counter-terrorism financing and proliferation financing, it's a little different, where clean money that is already in the financial system can be used to further the crimes of terrorism and the crime of proliferation financing, which is related to terrorism. And Madam Speaker, we would have debated recently in this House the bill related to non-profit organizations and the non-profit sector. And I had given the example in that debate, Madam Speaker, of where there is no regulation of the non-profit sector, how easy it is for...
48(1).
What is your problem, lady?
Please continue.
I had given the example, Madam Speaker, where an unregulated non-profit sector could lead to terrorist financing as well as proliferation financing, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, I support the Honorable Attorney General in this bill. I reject everything that the member for Naparima has said. And Madam Speaker, on behalf of the people of San Fernando East, I support this, including Oropouche East and including the member for Naparima. Madam Speaker, we support this bill, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Member for Kuva.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for this opportunity to contribute on the Financial Institution Act, the Securities Act, miscellaneous provision on proliferation funding and financing. Now, Madam Speaker, we have heard the previous speakers give the definition as Diego Martin Northeast and the member for San Fernando West. They gave all the background and the history to this particular piece of legislation that they've brought here today. And when we look at the guidelines that are, well, that the Global Forum and the CFATF report has in terms of how we implement these pieces of legislation that we have signed on to, I just want to draw a reference to a model in the US that has been put forward as a piece that other countries can follow. So, Madam Speaker, one of the questions asked, why is the prevention and detection of proliferation and its financing important? And in this particular document, proliferation financing facilitates the movement and development of proliferation-sensitive goods. The movement and development of such items can contribute to global instability and may ultimately result in a loss of life if proliferation-sensitive items are deployed. Another question to ask in terms of recommending to countries to set up their model and their system, what are the difficulties faced with identifying proliferation and its financing? And there are a number of difficulties associated. A growing trend in the purchase and sale of elementary components as opposed to whole manufactured systems. The individual elementary components may also have legitimate uses or dual uses of goods, making their identification for illegitimate purposes even more problematic. Dual goods are difficult to identify, requiring specialist knowledge, and can be described in common terms with many uses such as pumps. Thirdly, networks through which proliferation-sensitive goods may be obtained tend to be complex. This, combined with the use of false documentation, allows for proliferation-sensitive goods, the entities involved, and the associated financial transactions, and the ultimate end user to avoid detection. Front companies, agents, and other false end users are often used to cover up the ultimate end user. And fourthly, the risk of proliferation financing is more likely to be present in cases where the source of funds is legal and the end user of a type of goods involved is obscured, making identification of such activities difficult. So, Madam Speaker, these are some of the difficulties identified when you are trying to deal with proliferation and its financing. So what I would say as a country, when we implement this AG, and I'm asking the question, what sort of mechanisms or systems are you going to put in place, really, to deal with the identification and how we identify proliferation funding? Another question, Madam Speaker. What are the relevant international obligations in respect of proliferation and its financing? And in the US, we have the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, Security Council Resolution, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and we spoke about that earlier on. And they also went on to mention that whilst the primary focus on this particular UN SCR 1540 that I mentioned earlier is the implementation of export controls, a number of jurisdictions have implemented targeted financial sanctions in order to meet the finance-related obligations contained in the UN SCR 1540. Another question, Madam Speaker, are there any proliferation and proliferation financing offenses in Trinidad and Tobago? That's another question that we need to ask ourselves. And in the US, there are 3 offenses in law relevant to the development, production, acquisition, retention, and transfer of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And those 3 offenses apply in respect of acts performed outside of the U.S., nationals resident in the U.S., and bodies incorporated under the law of the United States. So again, AG, this is something to consider in terms of dealing with proliferation financing. Madam Speaker, and as I go on, what reporting obligations apply? So in this particular case model, the Proceeds of Crime law, I know we have the Proceeds of Crime Act here, AG, the Crime and Security.
Standing Order 4410, please. Is the whole speech going to be...
I'm referring to a model that...
But you haven't linked it to anything.
All right,
Just
okay.
reading it out.
Members. The member raised the standing order. I'm entitled to rule on it. And I will allow you some leeway because I think you are referencing. Okay, so please continue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So what reported obligations apply? So as I said before, the Proceeds of Crime Act that we have here in Trinidad and Tobago, Crime and Security law, the terrorism law, well, we also have that also that has been passed here. So these are some of the laws that can apply in terms of reporting obligations with respect to proliferation financing. Another question to ask in terms of making this law applicable, how can proliferation and its financing be targeted? And there are two recognized mechanisms by which proliferation can be targeted, namely export controls and financial measures. What are export controls, Madam Speaker? Export controls, they are very important, and proliferators, they act globally. Diego Martin, Northeast Red too, you know. Right. Proliferators act globally, Madam Speaker, masking their acquisitions as legitimate trade. Proliferators are known to exploit global commerce, for example, by operating in countries with weak export controls. And we need to ask ourselves, in Trinidad and Tobago, do we have weak export controls? And the Attorney General in his winding up can probably answer that. Utilizing free trade zones where the obtaining and or shipping of such goods are more likely to escape scrutiny. And the Minister of Finance addressed that aspect of free zones when he was reading off his laptop. In addition to that, operated in countries with high volumes of international trade. We need to ask ourselves, are we a country that operate with high volumes of international trade? So that is why these export controls are important, and these questions are important to ask. Madam Speaker, export controls are the primary counter-proliferation safeguard, focused on preventing the illegal transfer of proliferation-sensitive goods. And reports to the United Nations suggest that only 80 out of 192 countries apply export controls with varying degrees of implementation. So one can say in Trinidad and Tobago, we have weak export controls. Another may argue, a government member may argue and say, no, we have strong export controls. But from the stats given here, only 80 out of 192 apply export controls. So the big question is, are we applying our export controls? Another question, Madam Speaker, that we can ask, why are financial measures important? And financial measures act as a supplement to effective export controls to address the financial activity associated with proliferation. Similar to international criminal networks, proliferation networks use the international financial system to carry out transactions and business deals. Institutions should be alert to the possibility that their customers may be engaging in or facilitating proliferation activities. So financial measures are important. I remember in a previous bill that the Attorney General brought to the House, we had issues with NGOs, their operations of fundraising, and then taking those monies and sending it to other countries where it was suspected that they were sending funding for terrorist groups. So financial measures are very important and how we address them. Now, there are suggestions that 3 areas where institutions might have responsibilities in relation to proliferation financing, namely the risk assessment of customers and their products, enhanced due diligence on high-risk transactions and entities, and special attention to trade finance and insurance products. So financial measures with these 3 can really help in terms of applying proliferation financing laws. Another question, Madam Speaker, that we can ask, how should risk assessments of customers and products take into account proliferation and proliferation financing? And a current risk assessment practice should be proportionate given the overall proliferation risk associated with the activities undertaken by the institution. For example, an institution operating internationally or with an international client base will generally assess a wider range of risks, including proliferation risk compared to a smaller domestically focused institution. Another factor that we need to look at is the country and the geographical risk, the customer risk, the product and service risks, enhanced due diligence on higher risk transactions and entities. What verification can be sought regarding goods? This is another recommendation that we can make to implement here. Identifying whether a particular good is a dual-use good or otherwise a proliferation concern is acknowledged to be difficult. Thus, in higher risk scenarios where the customer is importing or exporting goods, institutions should be alert to the need to mitigate against inadvertent proliferation financing. And this can be achieved by asking the customer for the following: a valid export license and license not required letters that are less than 3 months old. And if a customer is unable to provide the information referred to above, then an alternative is to ask that customer to provide evidence by reference to export control requirements in the relevant jurisdictions that the goods being exported do not require a license. So this is a mechanism and a recommendation for the government to follow. Another question we can ask in terms of making this law really workable: should special attention be given to trade finance and insurance products? And it has been suggested that a fairly significant proportion of proliferation activities will use trade finance as a vehicle. Thus, special attention should be given to certain trade finance and insurance activities. For example, Madam Speaker, direct loans or general credit facility to facilitate export transactions, purchase of promissory notes or bills of exchange issued by foreign buyers to exporters for the purchase of goods and services, freeing up cash for the exporter. Factoring, the purchase of discounting of a foreign account receivable for cash at a discount from the face value, and provision of guarantees to or by financial institutions on behalf of exporters, such as pre-shipment guarantees and performance guarantees. Now, Madam Speaker, they have also identified a list of red flag indicators. And to assist with the awareness of potential proliferation financing, a list of red flag indicators are given. And some of these red flag indicators, for information purposes: customer, with respect to the customer is involved in the supply, sale, delivery, or purchase of dual-use, proliferation, sensitive, or military goods particular to higher risk jurisdictions. The customer or counterparty or its address is in the same or similar to one of the parties found on publicly available lists. The customer is a military or research body connected with a higher risk jurisdiction of proliferation concern. The customer activity does not match the business profile. The customer is vague, particularly about end user and end use, and provides incomplete information or is resistant to providing additional information when sought.
Dr. Levy, but you can't, in a debate, read a whole article.
Yes.
And while it's dealing with proliferation financing, I think you really now need to tie what is here into what you're contributing.
All right.
There from that article.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm about to wind up anyhow. So what I will do is just summarize some of the other recommendations that were given, and I can probably send the document across to the Attorney General later on. So we have red flag indicators to the customer. We have transaction orders that are also red flag indicators. We have jurisdiction in terms of the countries with weak financial safeguards, which are actively engaged. So those are red flag indicators. Other indicators, Madam Speaker, I just want to quickly identify. The final destination is unclear of the end user. Project financing, declared value of shipment, inconsistencies in information contained in trade documents, and use of fraudulent documents and identities. Those are some of the red flag indicators.
And I still needed to tie it into what we...
Well, Madam Speaker.
All right, tie it into this.
So as I tie in, Madam Speaker, this particular model actually are a list of recommendations after we have implemented this legislation into our system that can be used to develop in order to identify and deal with proliferation financing. And Madam Speaker, I want to strongly suggest that, I mean, yes, all is well with good legislation laid, but it's how we implement and use them to protect and safeguard our citizens. I thank you, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, I had the displeasure of hearing an emotive outburst from the member for Oropouche East a moment ago, who contributed nothing to this very important matter that is gaining the attention of this House on this evening. Madam Speaker, I'm not surprised at his behavior. It reflects a level of ignorance.
Madam Speaker.
48-4.
Madam
48-4, madam.
No. That is not a bad word.
I'm not sure who stood and on what standing order. Because two people stood. Member for Laventille West, and again, member for Couva South. If any time later you want to join the debate, I will allow you to join it in a proper manner. Member for Laventille West, I would like you to put that in another way. Okay, it sounds a bit like if it's a personal reflection. I don't think you mean that. So with all your eloquence, I'm certain you could put it in a way that will be acceptable to my ear.
Madam Speaker, I can assure you, it's never personal, particularly when it comes to the member for Oropouche East. Madam Speaker, I try to use words in the pure and the most innocuous sense. I use the word ignorant, Madam Speaker, and I'm not going to repeat it in the context in which I just used it. I'm just saying I used it innocently. It simply means a lack of understanding, a lack of knowledge. It was as simple as that. I meant no harm. Madam Speaker, I was making the point, however, that I was not surprised at the apparent lack of understanding and sensitivity displayed by the member for Oropouche East. Because in 2005, I recall, Madam Speaker, I had the occasion, and I'm linking this, and before I go one stage further, let me congratulate the member for Dago Martin Northeast. His presentation was more than scholarly, Madam Speaker. It was prolific as we spoke about proliferation financing. And Madam Speaker, I recall when in 2005 I had the honor to present the anti-terrorism bill to the House of Representatives for its consideration. I distinctly recall members of the opposition, and in fact, in the wild publicity that it generated, there was arranged, and the member for Barataria San Juan participated, if my recall is right. There was arranged a forum at the University of the West Indies. I was invited. The member for Barataria San Juan, I think, was also invited on a panel. Gillian Lucky as well. And Justice Gillian Lucky, as she now is. And we went there. I think Alan Alexander of Senior Counsel chaired those proceedings. And I found myself defending in Trinidad and Tobago the wisdom
and the policy of the government that supported the anti-terrorism bill at the time. Because they argued, Madam Speaker, that terrorism did not exist in Trinidad and Tobago. And by bringing such a bit of legislation, it would actually create the ire of terrorists so far away from us in the world, and that it will encourage them to be aggressive towards Trinidad and Tobago. That was what we heard, but we disregarded that, as we normally do, and we acted in the public interest. We passed the bill. Today, it is the law of Trinidad and Tobago. And as the Attorney General would oft tell us, and as the member for Dago Martin Northeast told us today, in the absence of that legislation, we would have been faring very badly in the assessment that our international partners, whether it is in the Global Forum, whether it is in the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, or the more general and larger Financial Action Task Force, we would have been faring very badly had we not done that. Because as the member for Dago Martin Northeast pointed out accurately in my submission, this really has to do with terrorism. Something that unfortunately we experienced, though fortunately on a much lower scale in Trinidad and Tobago, because you may recall, we had a couple bombing incidents around Port of Spain and one in St. James, where a citizen of this republic, I think from the Arima district, lost a leg on Frederick Street. A 63-year-old lady, I'm being reminded by my friend from Tabaquit. Bins, they were using bins, and as I speak about bins, I spent time in another country where standing next to a bin was a frightening exercise. In those days, the IRA, as a hostile group in the British Empire, representing a separatist philosophy, threatened citizens everywhere across England with bombings, with attacks. And one of the favorite places they used bins on the underground rail system and created mayhem. Terrorism is quite a serious matter. And we are very vulnerable to this in Trinidad and Tobago. So what we do here, and I too must congratulate the Attorney General, because he has been very focused, acting on behalf of the cabinet, the government, and all of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, whether they understand or not, whether they appreciate what he's doing or not. This is not only about satisfying our international obligations, but equally, Madam Speaker, it is about protecting the people of Trinidad and Tobago. It is about that. We have quite some vulnerabilities in Trinidad and Tobago that we in the National Security Platform must pay attention to. And the threat is not only and always homegrown. And like every other country, we have homegrown issues. We have individuals in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, we are reputed, sadly, to be the highest producer or exporter of citizens who would go to fight and support terrorist activity in other parts of the world.
Per capita.
Per capita. So we are not immune to what is happening. And when they finish with their training and their philosophy of suicide attacks and all the mayhem that they learn to create, and very skilled in the use of arms and creating and building bombs and developing methods to hurt many more than one or two people at a time, they come back to Trinidad and Tobago. And we find that since they would have committed no crime in Trinidad and Tobago, there was a time we were unable to deal with them. But of course, the Honorable Attorney General identified this as a problem. And recently we moved amendments to create offenses
and to protect the people of Trinidad and Tobago from people who are deemed and known to be terrorist fighters abroad. So what we are doing here today, Madam Speaker, is of signal importance in the lives of the innocent people of Trinidad and Tobago. The terrorists do not discriminate. I was in London in 2017. I happened to be there at the time when there was an attack on the Parliament. In fact, you, Madam Speaker, sent me to London to participate in a parliamentary program there. I was there. Fortunately, not in the area of the issue, but there was a terrorist activity by a homegrown terrorist to that jurisdiction, using not a weapon of mass destruction or even a firearm, but using a vehicle which the world has seen within recent years has become a major tool and a weapon in the hands of the terrorists. So when we talk about proliferation financing and financing generally, it is all part of this very sinister activity that is terrorism in the world. And in that incident, Madam Speaker, just to remind myself, and members, in the event that we forget, in that incident, 49 people were injured and 6 eventually died using a vehicle. That included 11 British citizens of the people injured, US citizens, Romanian, 4 people from South Korea, 3 from France, 2 from Greece, 2 from Italy, 1 each from Australia, China, Ireland, and Poland, and Portugal. And 18 of them not stated in terms of their nationality. I went through that, Madam Speaker, to make and to underscore the point I'm making that the terrorists are non-discriminatory in their approach. Once they could get a plane down with 567 people or thereabout, it doesn't matter to them who is in the plane. Ages, religion, their success is what it is. So, Madam Speaker, what we are dealing with here today is as serious as that. So when the member for Oropuchis jumps up, screams, and takes his seat without making any contribution to this, he thinks he has done himself a favor. He was applauded by his colleagues on the other side, showing callous disregard for the seriousness of what we are dealing with here, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, so important it is, we had to amend this, the Anti-Terrorist Act, on no less than 4 occasions, or even more. In 2010, in 2011, in 2011, 2012, 2014, and we would continue because compliance is the key. And I don't have to repeat it. I think all of my colleagues in this House now understand that failure to comply with our international obligations, at least in terms of the CFATF and FATF arrangements, 40 recommendations, 11 outcomes, all expected of us. And the member for Dago Martin Northeast was telling us that in the scheme of things, in the geopolitical environment in which we is, and in terms of power relations in the world, what China could do, what the United States could do, what perhaps England could do, little Trinidad and Tobago can't. So we are obliged in the circumstances, as he explained, to comply to the letter with these moving goalposts, because as we have discovered, when you fix one thing, something else is presented to you. And it's a moving target. But Trinidad and Tobago is faring very well and must be congratulated. Madam Speaker, not too long ago, when the uncaring attitude that you saw here today through the lips and the conduct of the member for Oropouche East was manifest and displayed by his entire government team. And it is manifest in the sense that when they were at the wicket, if you may permit a metaphor, they did absolutely nothing other than commit us to another line of obligations in the global forum, but they did nothing to get us there. Nothing. We are now in a position where a week and a half ago, I had the good fortune to attend some of the assessment that was taking place on Trinidad and Tobago, standing in terms of these obligations at the Hyatt. Didn't stay very long because I had other state business, but I was quite pleased to see and to hear and to understand the way they spoke of Trinidad and Tobago and the work of our Attorney General in advancing our cause. And he must be congratulated. Must be congratulated. Madam Speaker, the member for Dago Martin Northeast quite rightly pointed out, and I think it is a moot point in some ways. Moot is not the word I was looking for, but I couldn't find it. It is now accepted that it was 9/11 as a global event that really drove a lot of the activity that we are seeing now, Madam Speaker. That event. And Madam Speaker, it is out of that a lot of the movement that is taking place and the need for compliance has been driven. But in terms of that, Madam Speaker, a lot happened inside of the United States of America. I speak here on behalf of the people of Laventille West this evening. And I am concerned because we have schools, we have a special education project focusing on 21 primary schools in the Laventille area, 4 secondary schools, and we have other institutions. I speak on behalf of them, and every single thing that is emerging before us today is of interest to this member of parliament because I see vulnerabilities all around. But in the United States, following 9/11, they realized they had some issues in terms of their own security. They had the silo phenomenon where some agencies, the FBI, had information that the police department may not have had. And as a result of that, and the CIA may not have had, as a result of that, out of that was born the Homeland Security concept, where they put them all together and have a closer relationship, as our Minister of National Security told us in this House, much to my and hopefully our satisfaction. He has been trying to build that kind of thing in the national security effort in Trinidad and Tobago. So as we discuss proliferation financing, and we may think that this has only to do with issues in faraway places like the Middle East. It can affect us here because this deals with nuclear proliferation of financing to support nuclear and chemical warfare. I remember during the Gulf War, as it came to be known, we saw Saddam Hussein display Scud missiles. And I know the fear that the world carried. It turned out that he did not have weapons of mass destruction, as some thought. But there was a fear that he had the capacity to deliver chemical warfare to far-off places from Iraq. And Madam Speaker, it is, in that sense, could you ask, Madam Speaker, the member for Naparima, having jumped up and down in an earlier presentation like a wooden, animated, reminiscent of an object. He has now come closer to me here and is now interfering in my presentation. Madam Speaker, could you protect me from that toy?
Masqueraded as a member for Karen Central.
Member for Laventille West?
My lady.
I'm sure it's not going to continue. You just
I'm obliged.
train your discussion this
I'm obliged. I see he has departed my company. Madam Speaker, quite quite a serious matter, as I was saying before Duppy got in my way. Quite a serious matter, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, proliferation financing is not only about chemical and biological issues, it's also about nuclear issues. And if the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago paying close attention to this debate, as I think they do and should, we had this world, when I say we, there was in this world the so-called 1986, I remember it well, the Chernobyl disaster, where there was a meltdown of a nuclear plant in the Ukraine, Eastern Europe.
Eastern Europe.
You see, the member for Naparima shouting across at me. Western Europe, you know. And that man represented Trinidad and Tobago at the United Nations, you know.
Who? Do both. Don't mention institutions.
All right.
Madam Speaker, can you protect me from the member for Naparima? He probably had some Edo's punch.
Member for Naparima, you had your opportunity, and what I would like to say is if there are things you would like to say, having used your opportunity, you can pass notes to another member on your side to contribute. Member for Laventille, I expect with your experience you'll train your contribution this way, and you won't allow yourself to be distracted.
I thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I just remembered that he told me he grew up on Edos, which he got from his backyard. And he lived adjacent to a cemetery. It appears as though the roots of the Edos got into some cadaver somewhere. Madam Speaker?
Members, please abide by the standing orders in terms of the cross-talk. Cross-talk is not permitted, and every member who gets up to speak therefore will also abide by relevance. We will forget about the Edos and
I thank you. Madam Speaker, let me return to this very unfortunate human experience of the Chernobyl disaster. Just to share with my colleagues that when we talk about proliferation financing here today, we are talking about, as the definition says, let me remind my colleagues, proliferation financing means the act of providing funds or financial services which are used in whole or in part for the manufacture, acquisition, possession, development, export, transshipment, brokering, transport, transfer, stockpiling, or use of nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons and their means of delivery and related materials, including both technologies and dual-use goods used for non-legitimate purposes. I'm reading the definition. What?
Order 55(1)B. The definition has been read by more than 7 speakers already.
So, Madam Speaker, am I not entitled as a member of this House?
Unfortunately, there's no right of rebuttal on a standing order. Please continue, Mr.
I thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as I was saying, let me try to pick up and we'll not start again. Including both technologies and dual-use goods used for non-legitimate purposes in contravention of any written law or, where applicable, international obligations. Madam Speaker, the simple point is it includes the threat of nuclear, and I was saying particularly to the younger citizens, those born around and after 1986, who may not have occasioned to read this history. In that Chernobyl disaster in the Ukraine, 237 people suffered from what they call acute radiation sickness. 37 people died within 3 months of that meltdown and the exposure to that radiation. It took 66,000 people or thereabout to begin and to carry on the cleanup exercise of that. And in so doing, 5,722 of those 66 people became casualties in the very cleanup. That's how dangerous this thing is. We use nuclear for power, but it is very, very, very dangerous. And proliferation financing in this time is focused on preventing development of these arsenal, that kind of arsenal. And the systems of delivery, because the world is a very small place. And now that we know that the world is interconnected, now that we have a better understanding in terms of our ecological systems, and we are afflicted by Sahara dust in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, and such matters, these issues are not very far away. In the first 4 years, the scientists observed that 350 animals were born with strange complaints: extra heads, missing ribs, missing eyes, deformed skulls. All of these and cancers have been affecting the people in that part of the world constantly since that time. It is anticipated that the death toll arising out of that should be about 4,000 people altogether. And the cancer issues going forward. So these are very, very serious matters. And let me bring this to our local experience. We've been having a series of robberies and all kinds of crimes in the Caribbean, let me say that. And these criminals, you may think that they are ordinary street criminals looking for a hustle, but they accumulate over time millions of dollars. And if they are connected, as in some cases they are, in the radical stream to terrorist groups, we have to pay attention to this and to determine with proper inquiries what is this money being accumulated and to be used for. So, Madam Speaker, this whole situation is of serious concern to serious people in Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam Speaker, it falls to us as parliamentarians as we amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, where, Madam Speaker, the Securities Act is to be amended here, and the Insurance Act as financial institutions. And, Madam Speaker, the reason for this is because in the business of financing, these institutions could be used in ways that we did not intend them. And, Madam Speaker, these amendments today do not stand on their own. I want to remind my friends, they form part of a patchwork, if you like, a quilt arrangement. You know, Granny used to take little bits of cloth and weave them into another, well, not crochet. And before long, you have what we call the quilt. It's not crochet. That is not crochet. Remember for Naparima shouting crochet again. So, Madam Speaker, these don't stand on their own. They come alongside a whole host of other matters that the Attorney General and this government has been presenting as we put together this quilt in the protection of the people of Trinidad and Tobago on the one hand, and on the other hand, complying with our international obligations so as to prevent Trinidad and Tobago from becoming what is known as a pariah or outrider state and interfering with the quality of life of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Because when you become an outrider or an outlier or a pariah state by virtue of non-compliance, well, I don't have to repeat it, all of the adverse consequences, Madam Speaker, would flow. So, Madam Speaker, let me reflect for my colleagues some of the things, because nobody has spoken about this yet, so 55-1 is not an option. Not one person in this House. And I listened very carefully and took copious notes, Madam Speaker, of all, especially the member for Old Puch, who wasted 1 minute of our time.
And that affected you.
Affected me? I tell you, I stand unmoved. Madam Speaker, what we know, as now that we understand what proliferation financing is in the theoretical realm, and now that we understand, Madam Speaker, where it fits into the ugly business of terrorism, regional, local, international, we need to be acutely aware of the situations which indicate to us that there is proliferation financing activity. Similar to the anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing practices that we are expected to put in place in all of the financial institutions. Under the Proceeds of Crime Act, which is all in articulation with the anti-terrorism law, with these amendments.
Member for Laventille West, your original 30 minutes are now spent. You're entitled to 15 more minutes to complete your presentation, if you wish.
Thank you very warmly, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, under the Proceeds of Crime Act, Chapter 1127, which, as I indicated before you caught my attention, Madam Speaker, in that procedural motion, there are what we call, what is now known as listed businesses. And these include real estate businesses, motor vehicle sales businesses, gaming houses, of which there are many in Trinidad and Tobago, hiding under the umbrella of, what do you call them? Private members clubs, pool betting, national lotteries, online betting games, even jewelry. And talking about that, not too long ago in this country, there were some people buying very expensive jewelry. They have them. So when the civil asset forfeiture operators begin to work, they also must pay attention to jewelry, because there are some people who acquired very expensive jewelry that may not be easily linked to their income. And I know what that is. I had the displeasure of having to stand in public in this country and defend my home, which a former Attorney General in a debate in this Parliament suggested, Madam Speaker, was involved in corruption and within the meaning of the Proceeds of Crime Act, which articulates with anti-terrorism and the amendments we are making here today. Hence my mentioning it, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I saw that house on the television, and I had to defend it, and I had to show this country. I had a press conference, and I told the Integrity Commission, the Police Commissioner, the UNC, there's a straight line between my house and the FCB at the corner of Park and Henry Street. Everything you want to know, right there. They didn't bother to go, but they insinuated that I got my house, which I built while we were in opposition, by the way. But there are those who have accumulated very, very precious gems and jewelry. They may have to account for them in due time. But that is not the point I'm making. That was just our passer. The real issue is, under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and we do have as well the private members clubs, and then there are listed businesses, attorneys at law, accountants, trust and company service providers, art dealers, and all of these, Madam Speaker, listed in the Proceeds of Crime Act. So, Madam Speaker, the point I'm really making, as my time seems to be coming upon me, is that there are some possible proliferation financial activities that we have to look out for. The 2008 FATF Typologies report on proliferation financing provides a starting point, Madam Speaker, to assist both public and private sectors in understanding the threats and situations where customers, transactions, and other account activities may be involved in proliferation financing. And the elements, Madam Speaker, permit me, Madam Speaker, I read it earlier, but I can't boast of having retained all of it. Permit me just to read a couple of them, Madam Speaker, with your kind leave. Madam Speaker, the elements that may indicate proliferation financing includes transactions that involves persons or entities in a foreign country of proliferation concern. So just as the UN has identified the Democratic Republic of Korea and Iran and that kind of thing, there are countries that are identified with proliferation concern, and if you are dealing with those countries, that is a signal that we have something to look at. Transactions that involve a person or entity in a foreign country of a diversion concern. It is known to us, when I say so the world, that there are some countries that are used to divert. So you start with that country, but the financing will go to the third country. Madam Speaker, the customer or counterparty or its address, if the customer or counterparty or its address is similar to one of the parties found on publicly available lists of denied persons or has a history of export control contravention. A freight forwarding firm is listed as the product's final destination. So they list as the product's final destination the name of the firm that they're sending either money or these materials to in the context of the definition. Transactions which involve a shipment of goods incompatible with the technical level of the country to which it is being shipped. For example, there might be a country that does not have a nuclear power plant, but they want certain precursor chemicals. Madam Speaker, just on that note, Madam Speaker, just on that note, when you purchase vegetables today in Trinidad and Tobago, to tell you how restrictive the thing has come, you may want to disinfect those that you want to sanitize them before you cook them, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, I used to purchase up to about 3 years ago something called Condy's crystals. And you would put these in water, purple in color, it would dissolve, and you could wash your cabbages and your fruits and vegetables in there, and then you would consume them safely. I found that I could not get this in the drugstore anymore. And then when I did further inquiries, they have banned this product from export and trade because they are using them to make weapons for the use of terrorism. And so, Madam Speaker, I just mentioned that going forward. So if Madam Speaker, a country that is not known to have a certain kind of operation or development and materials and so are going there, then that is an indication that it's something, a red flag we should look at. As well, transactions that involve possible shell companies, companies that do not have a high level of capitalization or displays other shell company indicators. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, now that you have taken the chair, I must remind you, recently, because I made the point before you took the chair, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that these amendments today come alongside many other pieces of legislation that we have been systematically putting in place to protect ourselves, to protect our visitors, and certainly in terms of satisfying compliance requirements. But recently, the Attorney General came in here with the Non-Profit Organizations Bill and passed it. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that had to do with trying to deal with shell companies and people hiding assets behind these paper companies and so on. So everything is of great significance going forward. Transactions that demonstrate links between representatives of companies exchanging goods, same owners or management. Circuitous route of shipment. So imagine you want to send something from Trinidad, just to give an extreme example, to say Barbados, and the thing goes to Europe first, and then comes through Miami, and then comes to Barbados. That raises red flags. All of these listed here are not by whim. It is because of our human experience. Those who are responsible for monitoring these activities would have seen these things and are urging us in our own protection and in our cooperation for world peace and world safety to pay attention to these things. And finally, there's a list of about 20, but I've just chosen about 5 of them. I'll give 2 more. Customer vague, incomplete on information it provides. Resistant to providing additional information when queried. You see, like when you ask hard questions and they don't want to answer, that is a sign. Or new customer requests a letter of credit transaction awaiting approval for a new account, wire transactions or payment from or due to parties not identified on the original letter of credit or other documentation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as my time heads to its expiration, an old police officer told me that once a crime is committed, it cannot be uncommitted. That's a very wise comment. So once a crime, whether it's a financial crime or a terrorist crime or money laundering, there are footprints, and it cannot be uncommitted. And therefore the evidence is always there, and the signs are always there. What Trinidad and Tobago lacked are amendments like the type we are putting in place today, which is why we must do it. And Trinidad and Tobago up to recently lacked the civil asset forfeiture law, which fortunately we have put in place. So I would like, as I conclude, to congratulate the government of Trinidad and Tobago, because bit by bit, we have been making the legislative platform firmer and deeper and stronger. And against the background of the fact that crimes, even financial crimes, cannot be uncommitted, the future, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is bright. And therefore, with those things said, I would like to commend these amendments forcefully to this House, and I urge all of our support for them. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank you.
I recognize the Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank my learned colleagues for engaging in what is a very important debate. The reason for this level of engagement is multifaceted. It includes the fact that, as honorable members have already observed, the international community pays attention to what we are saying, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it is not lost upon the rest of the world as they reflect upon what we do in this chamber, that the words on Hansard are read by persons that are rating us and observing our situation. And therefore I wish to commend in particular honorable colleagues on this side of the House who have taken time to demonstrate the commitment that Trinidad and Tobago has with respect to this law. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the substantive contribution coming from those opposite was offered by the member for Naparima. And the honorable member started by saying that this law was a disrespectful law. He said it was rushed. He said that this debate was something that could have been managed in quicker time, because the honorable member posited that with the June 2016 publication of the Financial Action Task Force via the CFATF mechanisms, mutual evaluation of Trinidad and Tobago, the honourable member said you had since June 2016, and he made the submission that the government did nothing for 3 years. The honourable member then went on to speak about international cooperation, and he spoke to that and the series of activities in April 2015. The honourable member sought to list a number of matters which the member for Siparia engaged in and which then government engaged in. And he regaled us with stories and submissions of him being, the honourable member then being, Trinidad and Tobago's representative at the United Nations. President of the General Assembly, according to the honourable member. And then the honourable member went on to state in very bold fashion that Trinidad and Tobago, under the leadership of Siparia, Mrs. Prasad Bisesa, senior counsel, that Trinidad and Tobago, he said, I quote, when we left, we were ready to be delisted. So let me start with the member's submission. When we left, we were ready to be delisted. If you listened, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to everything the member for Naparima had to say, if you accepted that the member's contributions were a truthful, accurate account of the UNC's performance, I must ask this question. How then, when the Financial Action Task Force team and the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force team came to rate Trinidad and Tobago in January 2015, according to the member, Trinidad and Tobago was ready, UNC was ready, international cooperation was ready. How on earth did we fail the mutual evaluation report? How on earth did we fail the mutual evaluation report in our immediate outcomes? 11 out of 11 failures. In our 40 recommendations, barely 5 compliant marks. If you listen to Naparima, the UNC was ready. Mrs. Prasad Bisesa was ready. Siparia was ready. The meetings with Le Pen caused the honourable member to be ready. So how then did the international assessors come to this country to fact-check Trinidad and Tobago at the invitation of the deputy chairman for the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, was a fellow by the name of Anand Ramlogan. Trinidad and Tobago's representation saw Attorney General Ramlogan as the deputy chairman for the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. When we were assessed in January 2015, Mr. Ramlogan sat as deputy chairman and watched Trinidad and Tobago fail the entire exercise. It is shocking for this country to know that it was the Prime Ministership of Siparia that agreed that Trinidad and Tobago should be the first in CFATF to be assessed, first in the 4th round mutual evaluation, first in the exercise where we had not finished the 3rd round mutual evaluation. They say, forget 3rd round, roll it up in 4th round, we're ready. You know why? Because they listened to Naparima, obviously, because Naparima just told this parliament that the UNC had Trinidad ready for the exercise. Obviously, the UNC must have believed that, because they decided we in Trinidad and Tobago will be the first country in CFATF and one of the first countries in the world to undergo 4th round mutual evaluation. And what happened? Complete and abject failure. So, if we take the word of what is demonstrated in the mutual evaluation report on Trinidad and Tobago, published in June 2016 in hundreds of pages of black and white, we read what the international assessors from the world had to say about us. That's on one end of the spectrum, which I call the truth. And then we listen to Naparima come and tell this parliament the other end of the spectrum, which clearly cannot be reflective of the truth. So let's start off with characterizing the submission in the polar sense of what the whole world had to say about us versus what Naparima has to say about us. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it gets worse. The member for Naparima boasting just now in crosstalk about the positions the honourable member held in the United Nations. The honourable member says in his intellectual meanderings, says, Trinidad and Tobago, we on a list. We lime in with Ethiopia, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Syria. He said, Syria had no government, but the PNM is the government in Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad is one better, making a mockery of our country. Comes a gentleman who lived on the high end of life in the United Nations, in the lap of luxury, as the honourable member lived. Naparima has to say, we lime in on the list. And then he goes on to say, the honourable member, St. Vincent and the Grenadines come off the list. How is it Trinidad and Tobago can't come off the list? Mr. Deputy Speaker, intelligence requires some degree of homework. Submissions which go on the record of the Hansard require research. The honourable member said he read the whole weekend. He's an expert on the United Nations. I'm coming to that submission in a little while. The member for Naparima, as an expert, a paid representative living in the lap of luxury for Trinidad and Tobago at the United Nations, comes to tell us St. Vincent get off the list. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you know what is shocking about that submission? St. Vincent has not undergone its 4th round mutual evaluation yet.
Are you serious?
They're on the list because they're in the 3rd round mutual evaluation. And having come off the 3rd round mutual evaluation, the extreme intelligence of the well-paid high-end life of the United Nations living that Naparima experienced, where he's exposed to the UN resolutions, you know, because the FATF applies the UN resolutions. We have to hear Naparima tell us that St. Vincent off the list. I mean, for heaven's sake, that is called intelligence absent in action. That is what that is called. Intelligence absent in action. Running around while not knowing what you're saying or what you're doing, intellectually speaking.
It was 48-4.
What?
It is offensive to be speaking about the member for Naparima in that way. 48-4.
Member for Oakridge East, I'm not sure I'm on the same wavelength that you are thinking. And in that term, I overrule. Proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I can be very careful, I'm characterizing an intellectual submission. I'm not being pejorative to the honourable member. I'm characterizing what I consider to be intellectual absence in action of the advocacy put here.
Well put it.
That's what I put in.
Okay.
So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, let's press on. Read the wrong list. Does not know what the intellectual underpinnings for the Financial Action Task Force look like, sound like, or are. Spent 5 years in the UN where the list is, but still don't know it. 3.5. Well, 1 day is too much. Yeah. Honestly. 3.5, 2.5, 1.5. It's called 1 day is too much for Trinidad and Tobago. I feel ashamed, quite frankly. Mr. Deputy Speaker, let's press on. As the honourable member said, it was half-baked legislation, and it's sad. I want to come to a very important point. The member for Naparima gave way during the context of this debate and demanded, after he put a submission on the table, that I have the courage to stand up and supposedly offer an apology to the honourable member. The honourable member went into detail about the submissions that the honourable member supposedly gave, I will say that, on January 11, 2019, at page 208 of the Hansard, January 11, 2019 at page 211, January 11, 2019 at page 216, and then page 27. And the honourable member went on to say, that I ought to apologize because the honorable member supposedly went to the United Nations, supposedly met some unnamed, unranked individual, had a conversation with them somewhere in the world, and they said, according to him, let me get the word, he said Trinidad and Tobago said, that the UN said that Trinidad and Tobago said we were misadvised.
48.6. I went to the UN.
That's not 48.6. No, Miss, I object, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I object.
It was together.
I object.
Okay,
I object.
okay, thank you, member.
I object.
He was at
I
the
object.
Hold on 1 second. For Naparima, you had your turn. The AG is now winding up.
Okay.
Please, proceed, AG.
Thank you. You see, if I was the honorable member, I'd be jumping up just like that. Because the black and white version of the Hansard, which is in my hand right now, demonstrates an entirely different position from what the member said to us, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And you know, for a gentleman who constantly
Member for Naparima,
boasts...
hold on. Member for Naparima, please. You had your turn, please.
For a gentleman, as Naparima is, somewhere, to boast constantly that he's 70 years old and in the ripe age of mature understanding, who can't take pepper when it is being given to him at an intellectual level from someone that bothers to do the homework, he needs to keep quiet most respectfully. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I went to the Hansard and I pulled it up. The honorable member said that UNSCR Resolution 2231 was still in effect. And the honorable member, in giving the submission that he did, said that on 3 occasions, much like when Jesus Christ was denied 3 times, on 3 occasions, the honorable member supposedly said that he acknowledged that UNSCR 2231 was in existence as it relates to the Iran order, and that the Attorney General supposedly had this. The UN says Trinidad and Tobago was misadvised. I don't know what our word is, right? But it was misadvised. Anyway, so here, how old are you?
70.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, contribution of Rodney Charles, member for Naparima, as it begins at page 207. Started off by saying effectively that he'd like to find time to support this legislation, but I cannot in good conscience support this order. And I'll tell you what the order is. The economic sanctions, implementation of UN resolutions on the Islamic Republic of Iran, Order 2018. Madam Speaker, and I quote with your permission from page 208, this legislation is inconsistent with the resolutions of the Security Council as it stands today. The relevant resolution is 2231, which is the only resolution on Iran that is recognized by the Security Council. And what did Resolution 2231 do? Resolution 2231-2015, adopted by the Security Council at its 7488th meeting on the 20th of July 2015, question mark, it terminated all resolutions relating to Iran and terminated all actions relevant, economic sanctions that were applicable to Iran. You see, the honorable member forgot to read that part. The honorable member goes on, well, if that is the case, then this parliament is being misled today. I will say why. And the honorable member says the resolution terminated all previous resolutions. And then the member goes on to say, and I want you to look at the preamble to this order, because what all the resolutions quoted here as to the source for the power to operate and apply with sanctions have terminated. And then the member went on to read. The member then goes on to say that he supposedly checked with the IAEA and chronology of actions events in 2015. Somewhere in October, they informed the Security Council that they were satisfied that Iran had taken all appropriate steps to ensure that it had restricted its nuclear capability, and as a result of that, all these provisions that were applicable to Iran were terminated. Mr. Deputy Speaker.
You want to give way?
No.
Hold on 1 second. Chief Whip, I think I should speak to you now. Your member for Naparima continue to disturb. That's all I will say. Leader of the House.
Thank you very kindly. I think this is an opportune time to move the procedural motion, sir. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, in accordance with Standing Order 15.5, I beg to move that this House to continue to sit until the completion of the matter before it.
Honorable members, the question is that the House continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Honorable
Mr. Deputy Speaker, thank you. Hear what the honourable member had to say further at page 210. Madam Speaker, as I welcome Madam Speaker back to the chair. Madam Speaker, that is a falsehood. I checked with the United Nations Security Council and these resolutions do not exist. Madam Speaker, he goes on, nonsense, craziness. So here we are today, at page 211, he says, the honourable member for Naparima, he says, and I quote, so here we are today implementing something that does not exist and misquotes the United Nations Security Council and draws sustenance from that action. Member goes on, the Security Council is telling us that we have to give due regard to the changes. That is determination. So we are acting contrary to the requests of the Security Council. At page 213, Naparima goes on to say, so the question is, why are we here? Why are we here really if the United Nations Security Council has in fact not done anything after 2015 regarding Iran? I'll give you two more quotes in answering the allegations, the untruthful statements put on the record this evening. We are withdrawing from the accord because the accord states that sanctions, economic and otherwise, cannot be placed on Iran. These are the words from Naparima at page 214 on the 11th of January 2019. And the last one, I will quote, at page 215. It cannot be that we are doing this to comply with the UN economic sanctions against Iran because, as I have said before, that does not exist. That is what Naparima had to say. Living in the lap of luxury in the United Nations, holding on a position on the United Nations Council, having conversations with persons that have all kind of issues to answer. Naparima comes and demands an apology from me on these contents here. Madam Speaker, I want to say, when I began my contribution on that day and said that I thought that the member was guilty of, I'll quote, intellectual bankruptcy, laziness, lack of research, it is an argument presented that was insipid, wrong, vacuous. Those were the words put as to the argument, not the person. And Madam Speaker, in criticizing the member, we were obliged, both the minister, the member from Point 14 and myself, to correct those wild allegations coming from Naparima, because the fact is that the law, the United Nations UNSCR 2231, was a partial release as it is anchored in this bill. Clauses 2, clauses 3, clauses 4 of this bill clearly demonstrate that economic sanctions had to be applied. And that's where Couva North chimed in, merrily unprepared for the debate today. Couva North, merrily unprepared for the debate today, had this to say. What mechanisms for identifying persons? The honourable member asked. The honourable member goes on to say, are there any offences for PF in Trinidad and Tobago? The honourable member asked. She said this is something for the AG to consider. What are the reporting obligations for proliferation financing? Madam Speaker, why I said the honourable member for Couva North was merrily unprepared for today's debate. The Economic Sanctions Act, Chapter 8105, sets out the mechanism for the publication of the economic sanctions orders. The order made with respect to the legal notice 185 is that in respect of Iran, and 184 is that with respect to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The Parent Act and the orders provide in black and white detail in numerous pages of written publication exactly what offenses apply and exactly what prescriptions apply, how you are to monitor, how you are to list, how you are to delist, how you are to pass the publication information. So the honorable member for Couva North, in asking a question as if we don't have the law, in reading an article off of the internet, coming merrily unprepared for the debate, omitted to actually bury the intelligent argument
AG,
as
will
to
you
the
give way?
existence of the law. Sure.
Do you have in these laws all of the reporting mechanisms that I identified? All of them?
Sure. We have all of them that are anchored in the Economic Sanctions Act. And the economic sanctions, would you like me to give you again? Sure.
Sure. Yes, so those are the economic sanctions. What about the other types of reporting obligations?
The other types of reporting obligations are only required for us to pass muster. We are capable of moving to largely compliant, near full compliance, by the operationalization of this law, these economic sanctions orders as they stand in our law. We have been assessed, we are in the cusp of having the reports delivered, and the simple point is that it's there in the law, and they're very adequate. And let me tell you how adequate they are. You see, when Naparima was making the submission in the Senate, in the House, on the 11th of January 2019, in telling us the Iran orders were unlawful, there was no legislative springboard, we are legislating on things which the UN had effectively struck out, we were compelled to tell the member that the law was so entirely correct that we had gone to the High Court using the publication coming the same day as that debate, the 11th of January 2019. We read out the fact that the UN actually listed people, and then we pointed to the fact that we had in fact on that very day gone to the court and listed Fereidun Abbasi Davani, listed number 1 on the point. And what we did in our legislative perspective, we went further and we have actually listed 80 individuals and 75 entities under UNSCR 1718 sanctions list, and then 23 individuals and 61 entities under UNSCR 2231 list. To do that, let me repeat that. The list that Naparima told us does not apply. On January 11th, 2019, Naparima made a song and a dance, said he was going to write the UN and get evidence that Trinidad and Tobago was acting unlawfully, because according to Naparima, they canceled all of those things. On the same day that that debate was going on, we proved that it was in existence, but our High Court has listed 23 individuals and 61 entities under the same 2231 list. In other words then, exactly what Naparima said did not exist, the UN said existed, and the High Court of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago said existed, and the Financial Intelligence Unit acknowledged, and in their sharing of information amongst the Egmont Group and the financial sector involvement, all of them said it exists. The only person standing unique in this dance is the member for Naparima. Again, talking now about Privy Council. I don't know who could help Naparima, you know. I genuinely don't know who can help Naparima. And I want to say something as I talk about help. It's not often. It's been nearly 4 years in this office. I'd like to say this on behalf of the technocratic team in the AG's office. But permit me, Madam Speaker, as I defend the technocratic team today, let me start off by saying every single person that I met at the office of the Attorney General when I became Attorney General on the 9th of September 2015, all of the people who were working for the previous government, hired on contract by the previous government, under Attorney General Ram Logan and then Nicholas, all of them are still working for me today. And to hear the member for Naparima, who supposedly has a daughter who's a lawyer, as I understand it, the honorable member today called the lawyers working for the AG's office 2x4 lawyers.
Yeah.
And I want to stand up for the hard-working team that I inherited and that have worked their hearts out for Trinidad and Tobago and distinguish themselves as they sit in the back of this parliament and cringe Madam Speaker, in relation...
48.6, I never made a comment on the officers of the Attorney General's office.
But remember, I'm not sure that you use Standing Order 48.6 in the correct way. Okay? So that I overrule your objection. There has been no insulting or offensive language. AG.
Thank you. And lest I be accused without calling names, I will say, Madam Speaker,
remember, you can't sit there as if you're in your armchair, Attorney General.
thank you, Madam Speaker. I have WhatsApp messages, I won't condescend to the names, coming from the technocratic team, telling me that they feel insulted and offended at the characterization of their legal ability as 2x4 lawyers, Madam Speaker. And today I apologize on behalf of the members sitting here, with your permission, to the hard-working team. Because, Madam Speaker, they have no UNC lawyer and PNM lawyer in the Office of the Attorney General. When I came in as Attorney General, everybody was meted with the position that we are professionals. The first thing that we did at our Law Revision Committee, I, as the chair, asked how many attorneys general the room had served. There were people in that room who had served past 9 attorneys general sitting in that room. And there is a continuum in the Office of the Attorney General. And it is offensive to listen to the contributions coming from persons like Naparima as they insult persons that work for our country, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, what time is my full time?
You have left 2 minutes of ordinary time, and then you have 15 minutes of extended time.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, the member for Naparima told this country that he was going to write a book. I've come across a few titles of quite a few pieces of literature, and I wondered, Wheel Spinning, My Life in Politics. That was an interesting title I came across on another book. 12 Years of Intellectual Struggle. That was another one I came across.
Madam
in an
Speaker,
interesting title of a book that I had seen.
Overruled.
Thank you. So I'd just like to caution that when we are reflecting upon memoirs and on positions as they relate to this debate, and we're trying to come in and make allegations, come with facts. Come with facts, lest the title finds itself as a caricature or a meme in our country. Because we have very talented people in this country, you know, Madam Speaker. Very talented people in this country. Let's be careful about saying these things. Madam Speaker, there were some contributions surrounding the effect of the operationalization of this law. And I'd like to speak for a moment about the depth of management of this law. It might seem on the face of it, Madam Speaker, that we are being trite in the considerations of this law. Some persons believe that we have significant other issues to treat with. This government believes that there ought to be a quickened pace of attention. Let me remind you, Madam Speaker, as we consider this bill. This bill has been laid, it was laid on Friday for debate today, and it was laid because, number one, Parliament goes on the long recess at the second week of July. We now stand close to the second week of June. If you were to factor out private members' days and various sitting days, there's very little parliamentary space. And occupying...
General, your original time is now spent. You're entitled to 15 more minutes to wind up your presentation.
Should it please you?
Please proceed.
I was saying, Madam Speaker, in terms of why we're treating with this debate, it's important to remember that the time and space for discussion in this Parliament is scarce. And therefore, we sometimes have to abridge the time frames for positions. It's true that when you lay certain bills, that you may have a public expression of concern on this law, for instance, or another piece of law. A government would do well to listen to things at particular points in time, but we ought not to run off and panic. As it relates to this law in particular, it is a square obligation upon us that we need to make sure that this law applies and that the guidelines for the Financial Intelligence Act, the Financial Institutions Act, the guidelines issued under the Insurance Act, number 4 of 2018, the guidelines to be issued under the securities legislation, there must be a degree of harmony. Because what is on test in Recommendation 7, in Recommendation 7.3 in particular, is the ability of the government to make sure that there is an active presence of the law and that we have an outcome, an immediate outcome from the law. And when we're looking to the concept of international cooperation, it is certainly not what Naparima had to say. There is nothing to deal with training mechanisms in April 2015, as the member tried to tell us was relevant. The international cooperation is the international cooperation under our laws as they cooperate with each other and with external jurisdictions. We're looking... Sure.
Would you be kind enough to give us the raison d'etre for the incorporation of the terminology of proliferation financing in the 5 pieces of legislation that we have, which you are amending, basically by the introduction of proliferation financing? I have not been able to gather the reason for that.
Sure. I thank the honourable member. It's a most intelligent and valid question, if I may, Madam Speaker. One of the FATF recommendations, in particular Recommendation 7, Recommendation 7 is squarely and clearly written out that countries need to take steps to stop proliferation financing. Proliferation financing is anything involving weapons of mass destruction. They may be biological, chemical, or nuclear, or they may be masked. You know, where you use, for instance, agricultural products, and you use other base products which look innocuous on the face. It is radiopharmaceuticals, nuclear medicine, linear accelerators, all of those positions come into position. And what we're obliged to do is to keep a very careful watch. The 2 entities that are under economic sanctions orders, proliferation financing orders, find themselves really the Democratic Republic of North Korea, if I could call it that, DPRK, I forget how they put the phrase together, and Iran. Iran has been under a form of mutual assistance and cooperation, and there's a program for the lifting of sanctions as it relates to Iran. It's not that countries can't do business with North Korea or Iran. You must have a system of regime integration. You must have a system of approval by the minister for the transactions that are to be done. And in fact, it's constantly under review. So it is, number 1, a direct obligation. Number 2, it's to treat with the cash flows that come in relation to these monies. And as the outer world views Trinidad and Tobago as a member of the Caribbean Basin, having associative accounts with the Cayman Islands, with British Virgin Islands, in those instances, they look at our offshore situation and they're tracing the flow of money to make sure that the financial institutions, the designated non-banking institutions, the listed businesses, all of these institutions, those on the Securities Exchange via the Commission, all of them are aware of whose accounts are blocked, who is red flagged, and who you ought to report as having a transaction. It finds itself into the numerical data that we have in suspicious activity reports and suspicious transaction reports, some of which you see in the Financial Intelligence Unit reports, and others which you see as they're flagged by Central Bank, by Securities Exchange Commission, the Central Bank in its role as supervisor of insurances under the Insurance Act, under Act number 4 of 2018.
That's a requirement of FATF. And as you said, was it a particular number 7 of the recommendations that they needed to see introduced?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So in 2015, January 2015, Madam Speaker, we were non-compliant. We had nothing, literally. We had this Economic Sanctions Act, which was virgin. Not a single order published under it. It's the same way we had the Anti-Terrorism Act. We had an Anti-Terrorism Act since 2010 in its relevant form. And in the period 2010 go forward, we didn't have a single listing under the Anti-Terrorism Act. We've crossed 400 listings. We are now, Trinidad and Tobago's law is now the model of success for the Caribbean as it relates to anti-terrorism laws and operationality. Let me repeat that. It is our law which is the precedent law for CARICOM. It is our mechanism for the implementation of law, which is the mechanism for how to do it right. It is your Office of the Attorney General under this government that has done it right. In the entire 25-country basin that we are a member of, we are the leading members of that pack. And that is something that we should all feel a certain amount of national pride in. Because Trinidad and Tobago, via its parliament, passed certain laws. Trinidad and Tobago, via the advocacy of its chairmanship, certainly when I held chair, and then followed by Turks and Caicos as the Attorney General came into chair, and followed by the AG for Guyana, that tripartite relationship boosted CFATF into the zone where it is well respected in the world right now amongst the FATF-style regional bodies. So we've done well. Our country still has to push. We still have markers to achieve. We will constantly be on a revolving clock. The recommendations are not static. The FATF revises the recommendations at every plenary if they can. Certainly, we are applying recommendations as they have been modified up to this year. Up to this year, recommendations were modified. So there is no let's get off the list. Trinidad and Tobago's next venture is what we call an on-site visit. As we go to fight our case at the Financial Action Task Force beginning this weekend in Miami, and we sit down and we are assessed by 190 countries. They're going to look to us to see whether we have achieved the action plan as it is constantly moving. They're going to look to see what our immediate outcomes are. What's the effect of our laws? And let me point this out. Madam Speaker, what time do I end?
8:08.
8:08. Let me put this on the record. It was very relevant for us, not only to do the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Proceeds of Crime Act amendments, the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act, the Financial Intelligence Unit amendments. You know what made the difference for us? They are looking for our output on prosecutions. That's why we spent so much time doing the criminal justice reforms. Plea bargaining, criminal proceedings rules, criminal division courts, traffic courts, improved land package management. That's why we amended the Proceeds of Crime Act to go either way. That's why when we appear and the DPP is examined by the experts, the DPP will be able to point to landmark charges for money laundering. I won't go into the cases, but we now have in our jurisdiction operationality of our laws that have never happened before. We've done plea agreements and plea bargaining for the first time in relation to money laundering matters. We have done criminal justice reform of a type that has never been seen before. When the Trinidad and Tobago Police hired up a specialist prosecutorial division comprised of 32 forensic auditors and including forensic auditors and accountants and specialist prosecutors from the United Kingdom, that's a first in our jurisdiction. The game has changed. This is not the same old ground that we were on before. And our country is now considered as a serious country on the international platform. We are making our mark for doing the right material. I really do want to caution, when I listen to Naparima's contributions about we were misadvised and the honourable member supposedly went to the UN and somebody on a step somewhere who's unnamed had some dark conversation saying, I mean, come on. When you give information like that, and the world is listening, the world is listening to Naparima. The assessors are reading what Naparima has to say, and they say, but hold on. This is a 70-year-old, mature, considered member, as the Honourable Member has reminded us, who served at the United Nations. Surely that member could not just stand up and make it up. Which is why I have to be as sharp as I am in criticizing Naparima now, so that when they read the nonsensical submissions put on the record, they were answered immediately by somebody who bothers to put the facts on the record. And that is why I take such a heavy load to Naparima, because I really just don't believe you could stand up and make it up. It is not a wheel that you're spinning in an election campaign or a Ouija board that you're testing to see whether it's yes or no. It just is not that. So, Madam Speaker, this legislation is proportionate. It is grounded in facts. It is measured. It is required. And what we have to do as a country is to manage our affairs prudently. Madam Speaker, we were checking the United Nations positions and some submissions that came from the Securities Exchange Commission and the Central Bank. I've had to make a small amendment to some circulation, some amendments which we wish to put into circulation. I'd like to take this bill to the committee stage and to ask for that work just to be done. We may need 5 minutes or so to get it right, but we'd like to make a few amendments in the committee stage, which the technocratic team is putting together as we speak. They're not ready yet. I have not gotten that signal just yet. We just need a couple of minutes to sort that out, where we would propose some important, seemingly simple, but important amendments to Clause 4 of the bill. Madam Speaker, with these submissions now on the record, I look for my order paper and procedure paper, which I'm sure the clerk will pass to me so I can move the next stage, and I beg to move.
Honourable members, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act, Number 4 of 2018, be now read a second time. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. The Attorney General.
Madam Speaker, in accordance with Standing Order 68-1, I beg to move that the miscellaneous provisions, financial...
Clerk. Sorry.
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Institutions Act, Chapter 7909, the Securities Act, Chapter 8302, and the Insurance Act, Number 4 of 2018.
Attorney General.
Madam Speaker, in accordance with Standing Order 68-1, I beg to move that the miscellaneous provisions, financial institutions, securities, and insurance bill 2019 be committed to the Committee of the Whole.
Honourable members, the question is that the miscellaneous provisions, financial institutions, securities, and insurance bill 2019 be committed to the Committee of the Whole. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any against? The ayes have it. This House will now go into the Committee of the Whole to consider the bill, clause by clause. Honourable members, in light of what the Attorney General contributed in his closing statements, I will therefore suspend the meeting for about 10 minutes. Members will get an opportunity to refresh themselves. So we will return here at 8:20.
You amended?
Clause 4.
Clause 4.
Clause 4.
Okay? All right, so this meeting is now suspended. We return at 8:20.
Follow the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on Twitter. Our call sign is @TTParliament.
From the Hansard, the mace of the house.